colleague Alex Mwangi is on the ground. Alex, what is the latest from the Parliament buildings? We've seen some entourage driving into the building. What is the situation there?
Okay, Julian. So it's we've just seen Kenneth Lusaka, the Speaker of the Senate, get into the Parliament buildings, and given that this budget reading is happening during the pandemic, there's a lot of difference in as far as the way Parliament normally looks when a budget is being read. For example, right now I'm just standing outside the main entrance of Parliament, and normally what would happen in other years is that we would have a battery of journalists lined up outside here waiting for the CS to come from the Treasury building, at times usually walking, even carrying the briefcase. But this time it seems like it will be different. There's minimal activity even as far as journalists are concerned. There's minimal activity in as far as other MPs are concerned. And so Parliament looks, it's budget day, yes, but it looks quite deserted from what we are normally used to in as far as coverage is concerned. We also have, for example, the place where media houses normally park their outside broadcasting vehicles, which is about 50 meters in front of me, outside the mausoleum of the late first president of the country. And right now that parking is just empty. There's no vehicle, and there are not so many journalists who are here covering the budget. So given that because of the pandemic, this is also going to be another unique budget in as far as coverage of the budget is concerned. But we also know that and we expect that the budget is also going to have some allocations going towards the recovery of certain sectors that have been impacted adversely by the COVID-19 pandemic. And so that is one of the things that we are going to look at. We are going to be listening keenly on which sectors are going to be allocated maybe more money because of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, the health sector. Do we expect that more money will be pumped in order to equip hospitals and nurses and doctors with the adequate ammunition that they need in order to tackle the COVID-19 pandemic? That is one of the things that we are looking forward to listen to. And so it will be interesting to hear what Ukur Yatani has to say. We also anticipate with bated breath to hear what he's going to say also as far as revenue, gathering revenue is concerned, because we know that the government expects to borrow about 823 billion shillings in the coming financial year to balance the budget, and it will have debt implications of up to 904 billion shillings. We are almost getting to the 1 trillion shilling mark in as far as the consolidated fund services is concerned. So we are going to be keenly listening into what the CS has to say as far as the budget is concerned. Right now we expect that in the next few minutes that he's going to come from Treasury building, right behind me, just up to this entrance of Parliament building, and we're going to be covering that live for you, and we are going to have more information about the budget. We're also going to break it down for viewers later on after it has been read, and we're also going to get the reactions from Parliament. Back to you, Julian.
Right, many thanks, Alex, who remains at the Parliament scene just to capture all the detail which will be coming from there. And I should mention that in studio, I'm joined by Fred Omondi, who will be helping us unpack some of the issues around the budget. And also virtually joining us will be Mudhoni Wangai, who is a member of ISPAC. Fred Omondi, I should say, is a partner at Deloitte, which is the audit firm. So definitely we'll be getting a lot of insight regarding the budget process and the budget itself and some of the proposals which are there and how they are likely to impact your household livelihood, as well as your day-to-day business. But before that, Alex Mwangi mentioned something around the consolidated fund services, but let's dig into some of the numbers which by and large have caused a bit of confusion out here in terms of the large budget size we're looking at this year. So if you look at the Budget and Appropriations Committee report, which was tabled in the House last week on Thursday, the executive is supposed to be allocated 1.83 trillion shillings. The Parliament comes next at about 37.78 billion shillings in terms of allocation, and the judiciary comes in at 18.05 billion shillings, and therefore the total allocation to the three arms of government comes to about 1.88 trillion shillings, but it doesn't stop here. Let's move on to the next graphic just to put this into proper perspective. Moving away from that, if you look at what Alex was talking about, the consolidated fund services, and here we normally have the pension payments and things like debt service obligations, there is 1.03 trillion shillings allocated for this. And therefore, if you go back to the Division of Revenue Act, which was passed on April 30th, 2020, as required by law, the county's equitable share allocation stands at 316.5 billion shillings, and therefore total other allocations come to about 1.34 trillion shillings. And therefore, this is where the confusion now comes in, because if you look at all these other factors, without looking at the consolidated as well as equitable share, you're looking at about 2.7 trillion shillings thereabout. But if you add all this, then it comes to 3.22 trillion shillings. So therefore, the question now becomes, how does the government intend to handle the whole aspect of debt redemption, which is the maturing debt in the next financial year, which is a matter for debate here. There, of course, the government has been looking for a way of getting relief in terms of finding some breathing space in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. But let me now move to the discussion we're having in studio and just dig into the numbers, look at some of the proposals which have been tabled. Fred Omondi, welcome on set. We're delighted to have you to share some of these insights, as well as Muthoni Wangai of ISPAC. And I'd like to start with Fred, who is with us in studio. You have read the report from the Budget and Appropriations Committee. You have seen the build-up. We've looked at the Tax Laws Amendment Act. We've looked at the Finance Bill, which has now been tabled. How do you feel we are placed, broadly speaking, by way of just introduction?
Thank you, Julia. So, as many of us are aware, this is a unique year in the sense that, the pandemic that is having a devastating effect on the economy, not just in Kenya, but globally, has really changed the game. So that all predictions that we had, 3-4 months ago are no longer relevant. And therefore, the minister has to relook at all his, numbers, and he is going to be faced by, a shrinking resource basket. And given that reality, is really going to be in a difficult place, trying to meet all the, pressures of expenditure, which, as we know, has been on an upward trend. But in the current year, that would not be a luxury that he can afford, because there is no expectation of growth in revenue. In fact, on the GDP as a whole, the expectation is a significant, reduction in the projected growth from about 6% to 1.5%, and that could get even worse depending on how the pandemic develops. So the minister is not really in a good place, and so he's going to have to look at measures to really sort of reallocate expenditure or reduce non-priority spending, okay, to be able to fit within the resource basket. Mm-hmm. Of course, there is a likelihood that development expenditure will probably suffer more, yeah, because the recurrent tends to take priority in terms of actual spending. Yes. And also there is the likelihood that probably the government is then going to incur more debt if they are going to be able to fill in the shortfall in terms of revenue. So those are the realities that he's faced with. But at the same time, in terms of expectation of the ordinary mwananchi and businesses at large, is that the government will continue to extend stimulus package to cushion them from the current impact that is really being felt, across board. Okay. And of course, the president has already announced a number of these measures, but even in the budget, we'll be looking at how these are translated in terms of allocation of expenditure and what more, the minister will put on the table, the cabinet secretary. So I guess people are waiting with expectation. Yes. But, it would be good to temper that expectation, because we know that the reality is not one that, we can really have a lot of room for him to be able to wiggle.
Holding on to that thought, I want to bring in Muthoni Wangai, and I should say to our audience, by the way, that you can be part of this conversation online at NTV Kenya, at AmbokoJH. The hashtag is budget to KE 2020. Muthoni, if you can hear me, Fred here has talked about a diminishing resource basket, and many of us have looked at some of the numbers being put out by Treasury, especially with regard to ordinary revenue, which is put at about 1.6 trillion shillings. Do you see this as a feasible target this year?
It's going to be a challenging year, very challenging, and perhaps one of the things to note is that when challenges come is when you get to see the real managerial expertise of the government. It is a reducing resource basket, but we'll also know that because of that reduced activity in terms of business, there will also be savings because the activity is less. And then we do have a few things which are positive. For example, the falling oil prices. There is also the issue of agriculture, where because of the good rains, we are likely to have, even though we have issues with not being at the top of productivity, we may still manage to save a certain element of the agriculture because we have food in the country at the moment. The issues will come in supply chain and so on. But certainly, the minister has a challenge in the sense that he has to now adjust the numbers. We as accountants, for example, would like to see those numbers adjusted so that they are more realistic than what they are at the moment in terms of both collection and the costs. There are other things also which seem to be always kind of left out, things like the pending bills and so on. Some of them are not fully absorbed, just like in the counties where only partial amounts of the pending bills have been are normally built into the budget, and these are substantially not correct. So these things should be adjusted, and thereafter then we look at we should not lose the objective strategic direction of the budget. So you'll see, for example, in some countries, as soon as they open up, like in the US, the job trajectory has started going up. So we should be looking at a longer term strategy, both in terms of returning jobs and in terms of the whole economy, so that we are not lost in the short term. We are likely to get carried away a little bit by these particular figures for this year, and even in the short run in the next quarter. For example, now some of the schools are suffering because some expenses have not been paid, but we should still maintain our long-term strategy with changes which now should take into account what has happened, but take advantage of it. Things like manufacturing, we can see that the country can actually revert and in fact go better than it was before. We look at that on a longer term strategy so we don't get distracted by this short-term problem that we have. Thank you.
Thanks, Muthoni. And Fred, just to pick up from what Muthoni has mentioned, she's talked about an opportunity to re-anchor a sector like manufacturing, for example. But going back to the Tax Laws Amendment Act, for example, my reading suggested that a number of incentives that were there for example, the manufacturing sector were taken away in the government spirit to try and mop up all the revenue it can get. For example, the deductions in capital allowances. Yeah. Where do you feel the manufacturing sector, for example, stands, especially in light of budget 2020-21?
Yeah, so you're right. In a bid to plug the revenue deficit, obviously the government has focused on minimizing incentives and exemptions that were enjoyed by certain sectors, and manufacturing was one of the key sectors, and a number of measures have been put in place to incentivize or to grow the sector. So some of these have been proposed to be removed, which, like Muthoni mentioned, may be a short-term way of looking at it instead of looking at the long-term and how we can continue to grow that sector. So the key ones, like you mentioned, are the capital allowances, which the minister has proposed to radically reduce. And we think that that may impact in terms of the attractiveness of certain sectors, especially those that require huge capital investment. So in terms of attracting new investment, that will definitely be an issue. In terms of existing manufacturers, we think they'll be affected by certain measures which were proposed and have not really been put in place and now are being withdrawn. A key one, when the president announced his Big Four agenda, was, for example, the electricity rebate, which was meant to cushion them from high input costs. We see that there was a proposal to remove that, and we know that it has not even been implemented and really tested to see what the impact it will have. So these are some of the measures we think need to be looked at so that we don't, to quote Muthoni, to focus on the short term while forgetting that in the long term we still need to continue to grow some of these critical sectors. So we may need to sacrifice in the short term to avoid taking away some of these, critical incentives.
Okay. Yeah. And Mudhoni, to stay with the subject of sealing revenue leakages, when you look at some of the proposals in the finance bill, for example, when you talk about the digital services taxation and as well as the minimum tax, how do you feel about these proposals and how do you think this will pan out in the months ahead?
First, maybe it's just to support, one is to support what Mr. Mondi has said about the issue of the short term, especially the removal of the capital allowances. I think that's very short term, and we should be probably as publics now asking the minister to reconsider that, because very few people will come and invest and be able to recover their investments in a very short-term period. And this is a systemic issue in budgeting, that when you cut some of these things, I think it can remind us a little bit about the issue of capping interest rates. And you can see that in the short term, when the capping of the interest rates has been lifted, we have already increased the credit to private sector by 8.9%, of which 17% has gone to manufacturing, which means it's an incentive to the manufacturing sector. So capital allowances are very critical in the investment, because in the first few years of your investment, you're not likely to have any cash flows. And it's not only that element, it's a question of a rationalization of the investment model for the country to remain competitive. Because if someone has capital to invest, the other countries, for example, especially in the neighborhood, in the same trade preferential area. So if you're not competitive, then you cannot get that capital. So if we are serious about reviving these types of industries, we should be able to forego the short-term tax in order to get the long-term higher taxes, as well as the contribution to the economy as a whole, including in employment. I think I lost the question you had asked me. If you want, you can revisit it, and then we can answer that. Thank you.
Yes, Mudhoni, just to stay with you, my question was with regard to the bid by the government to seal the revenue leakages and try to mop up as much as it can in terms of revenue. Where do you feel proposals such as the digital taxes and the minimum tax leave the public in the next financial year?
I think you see, in tax policy is a very dicey thing, because one is that you are required to be fair, you are required to be equitable. At the same time, people don't want to be taxed highly. If you want to be equitable, it would be unfair to leave out people in the digital economy out of the tax bracket. I mean, and knowing that the trend now is towards digital economies. It's like saying, if, for example, we are not taxing Google, Google is not being taxed at where it is. And therefore, in fact, even as the country starts training its grounds on managing a bigger digital economy, taxing it could be something they cannot leave behind. But then there is also the issue of who is in the digital economy. The people in the digital economy tend to be the younger people. And again, incentives are required in this area. So the question is whether we would like to leave them out of the tax bracket for now, for them to grow their businesses to a level where we can get a better tax. However, that can be managed through things like rates and the methods of taxation. So the whole thing is that tax has to come from somewhere if we are going to manage the economy. And we need to think about the issue of being fair to everyone. And perhaps we can choose to exempt certain groups, or if not exempt, give them lower rates, because we want incentives in those areas, especially the younger people. And that would go in even into the issue of minimum tax. But we cannot say that everybody now gets out of the tax bracket, because there'll be no one to pay tax. In any case, the younger people now are the ones who are supposed to be taking over the tax burden. I know they're not like that, but because I'm a senior, I'm allowed to say that they want to get out of the tax bracket. And that goes also for the minimum tax. But maybe for the time, if you want to grow those businesses until a level where they have a critical mass, then the rates can be lower. And this also goes also to the issue of taxing the pensions, the monthly pensions for people over 65. And again, this is another thing which is a bit strange, a bit, you can call it a bit stunning, that we can be thinking of taxing seniors instead of exempting them, and maybe even adding what they pay in pension, not even noting how much tax will the country get from that. I think it cannot be very material, and those are things the minister can look at and perhaps exempt the 65. In any case, they have been saving in regimes which promise tax exemption. So it's a bit of even from a reliability part of the policy issue becomes a bit of a problem. And then for the digital tax, maybe think about what we do, because it's mainly the youth who are in that bracket. Perhaps we need to know their incomes, and then we can see the rates, whether the rates can be rationalized.
All right, and before I leave that point, Fred Omondi, I just want to get to you, especially this whole discussion around the minimum tax. You said taxation needs to be fair, and many are wondering, is it the appropriate time to be making some of these proposals?
Yeah, thank you. Before I move even to the digital tax, to the minimum tax, I would want to comment further on the digital tax. And Mundoni brought in an interesting perspective around, it may be affecting more the younger generation, who we commonly refer to as the digital generation, unlike some of us who may be a little older, if I may say so. But coming back to it, digital tax is a global issue that is now hot, on the minds of most governments and most revenue authorities. So in itself, it's a good proposal, because the economy is going digital, and therefore there's always been a focus that we need to find new ways to tax the digital, a more effective way to tax the digital
Just
economy.
to hold you there, Fred, I'm just mentioning that we have live pictures from the National Treasury, where we are expecting CS Ukur-Yatani to be leaving any time to make his way to the Parliament, where he will be tabling the budget for this year. Therefore, we shall remain on the ground just to keep an eye on what develops on that end. Fred, back to you, sorry.
So in terms of targeting the digital, the players in the digital economy, that is not unique to Kenya, and it's happening across the world as we speak. The issue there is the consensus is still developing around how best to tax them. So if you look at Kenya's proposal, it's a tax on the turnover, 1.5% of the turnover. However, there are questions around, do you really want to tax turnover? And what is this turnover? Or do you want to focus more on the profits? Also, the big issue around digital tax is that the target should be more the non-resident players who are not paying tax through the ordinary mechanism that we have, where you self-assess and file your returns if you are a resident taxpayer. So for the focus should be more on the non-resident. However, the current provisions are so open, and that's where the issues around probably it being seen as targeting the youth or the smaller startups is coming up. So I think it needs to be refined. In and of itself, it's not a bad proposal, but we need to refine the scope and who is really being targeted, and then work out very practical mechanisms. Because, for example, if we say that you are going to buy something online, on Amazon, are you the one who's going to account for that tax? Who's going to do it, So the practicalities around it need to be very clear, and we think that further guidelines are required to be able to make it a success. And coming to the issue of minimum tax, definitely the biggest challenge with that is the timing, because what the government or the Treasury is proposing is that even if you make a loss, and therefore under the ordinary regime you would not be paying any tax, that now you should be paying a minimum tax based on your turnover. The proposed rate is 1% of your turnover. So coming at a time when businesses are heavily and negatively impacted by the COVID pandemic, and we expect that many sectors are going to be reporting losses. Think about tourism, think about aviation, and even those sectors which we did not expect to be impacted are going to be heavily impacted. So it's likely that they're going to be in a loss-making position. So what essentially the Treasury is saying is that, yes, we understand you are in a tough position and you're going to make losses, but we still expect you to contribute to the exchequer. So really, in terms of timing, it's sending the wrong message, and I think that is something that should be held back and put in at an appropriate time, and also with a lot of caveats around it, because typically what we see is that it should not target you just because you are loss-making. It normally targets those who have reported long periods of losses. So it should be limited to, say, if you report losses for 5 years, but not in the first instance that, you could be affected by, economic situations or trading conditions that really have nothing to do with your own, planning or business, and then you still have to pay a minimum tax. So we think, as currently crafted, it leaves a lot to be desired, and it needs to be revised to take into account the issues that I've raised.
But Fred, if I may, and before I jump on to get Muthoni's thoughts on this, to be fair to the government, the government has extended a number of relief measures to cushion Kenyans in light of COVID-19. And the Treasury has told us that it is looking at a revenue hole of about 172 billion shillings in light of those measures. Don't you think it is only fair that in its bid to try and at least plug in this hole? Because otherwise, then we go back to the debt market, and of course, again, the public now comes and raises question about our debt sustainability.
A very good point to raise. But remember, we said we have to then contextualize this. So in the current environment, we are saying everybody is going to be hard hit. So this is the year when everybody, as you say, tightens their belt. And that includes the government. That includes you and me. I'm sure we are all going to be feeling the effect of the current economic environment. So in a sense, the government has to take a bit of a sacrifice or a hit. And individuals, businesses are also going to be in the same situation. So this is a year when everyone needs to tighten their belt. But coming to what you said, it is true that the government will give with one hand and take with the other hand. So yes, they've extended, tax cuts in terms of corporation tax, in terms of the lower income earners. The threshold has been, pushed up. So that is positive, and we do appreciate that, and that was a very good move coming from the government as pronounced by the president. But on the other hand, there are other measures that they've introduced that will definitely mean we will contribute more. So one is the digital tax, which is targeting the digital players. There's the minimum tax, which means some will pay more. There are certain exemptions that have been removed from a VAT perspective. So certain goods are going to be standard rated if the proposals are passed. Things like LPG, for example, is going to be standard rated if the proposals are passed. On the excise duty front, you might have heard already, there's a target to reduce, the remission that is granted to cheaper, let me call it that way, cheaper alcoholic beverages. So we expect that, alcohol and alcoholic products may, cost more if those proposals pass. So yes, there are certain proposals that they're putting in place to be able to recover more. But we think that this year definitely is one of those years where there should be a lot more consideration to what is the economic impact, not just on the households, but also on the sustainability of businesses, so that we try to, all recover from this situation, and then the government will harvest as we thrive, hopefully in the not too distant future.
Yes. Yeah. And Muthoni, just to get your quick thoughts around this whole debate on the minimum tax, what do you make of it, especially considering the kind of situation we are in presently?
I think just like Mr. Omondi has said, the government has been very courageous to give tax cuts in order to kind of form an economic stimulus. It's very, very rare you find governments coming up and giving tax cuts. And we know that the estimated saving to taxpayers will be like 122 billion shillings. However, when it comes to taxation, and then you do the tax based on turnover, which means it kind of ignores your profitability.
Sorry for that. We seem to have lost the audio from Muthoni there. But before we get back to her, let me just bring it in and inform you that the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury, Ukur Yatani, we're informed, is walking out of the office, and shortly he should be getting to the ground floor to make his way to the Parliament, where he should be tabling the budget speech for this year, something which, of course, has been widely anticipated in light of the economic situation that the country is facing. The government has announced a raft of stimulus measures beginning March this year, and of course many Kenyans have expressed their views in terms of the trickle down of some of the reductions we've had in with regard to value-added tax, pay as you earn, and many other, even corporate tax, because I think that's the Cabinet Secretary we saw there, who's about to get off, so that at least we see him with the symbolic briefcase, which is always held by Cabinet Secretaries of the Ministry of Finance, a tradition which has gone way back since independence. And something which is keenly looked at this year is how the government will be mobilizing the revenue. It is talking about, of course, 1.6 trillion shillings by way of ordinary revenue, which even the guest in studio, Mr. Fred Omondi from Deloitte, is indicating it's a rather ambitious target in light of the state of the business environment and the fact that many businesses might not do well enough to make their usual taxes. And there we have it. The Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury, Mr. Ukur Yatani, shortly will be delivering his maiden budget speech, which will be focusing on the recovery of the economy in light of the COVID-19 shock that we have suffered starting March this year, coming on the back of the Tax Laws Amendment Bill, which was later passed on as the Act. And also now we have the Finance Bill before the floor of the House, which is proposing a number of measures through which the government can mobilize more revenue to try and finance expenditure for the period between July 2020 and June 2021. And there we have CS Ukur Yatani holding the briefcase there, and that is something we want to listen into and see what is being said.
Come over, very good. There. Wewe simamisha hizo gari. Unapita hapa. Akikuja hapa mbele. Wewe acha bana. Wewe kama huna reli. Inua juu. Hapo. Asante. Kazi ni mzuri. Wewe wacheni akuje hapa mbele bana. Yes, no. Wanaenda kupanga laini hapo. Kupigwa picha hapo juu. Utamwambia yatakuja bado. Mtu atakuja saa hapo kutoka. Huyo anaitwa Rashohi. Serikali imebadilika. Si wao. Haimbaya Rashohi. Okay. Yes, planning when we prepare. Yeah, we also try to keep social distance. Hiyo ni kawaida. Yo, ni wanaume wale wengine. Hapa unapanga bila picha. Kama hiyo ndio unaona kwa nini?
Ya kwa kama sasa hapa. Tunataka
nani?
hapa na Central Bank.
And then we have the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury with his entire team. We can see the Principal Secretary as well as the Administrative Secretary for the Cabinet there. That is the moment that, of course, we are looking at building into the budget, which should be tabled any time from now at the National Assembly. Of course, this budget comes against the backdrop of extremely extraordinary circumstances, and many are questioning how the country will be able to raise some of the targets it has set for itself by way of revenues. And of course, the Budget and Appropriations Committee has indicated in its numbers that there's a targeted borrowing, both domestic and external, at about 823 billion shillings, which of course we'll be delving into in our discussion in studio. Many questioning whether this is something we should be taking on at this particular point, because we have been under immense pressure to seek more debt relief in light of the situation. And the budget books from the National Treasury further indicating that in the coming financial year we'll be having about 900 billion shillings in debt servicing obligations by way of redemptions and interest. So a very dicey conversation there with regard to debt sustainability and Kenya's fiscal consolidation path, which simply means that the government should try and rationalize its expenditure and ensure that it is living within its means. So this is a day that begins a very crucial process in terms of financing the next financial year, which runs between July 2020 and June 2021. Of course, this budget cycle has been unique in its own sense. Never before have we seen the finance bill already being debated in the floor of the House right before even the budget statement is tabled. But this came against an environment where last year we had a bit of push and pull, and there was almost delay in terms of how fast that bill could have been passed. Last year, again, in the financial year, we had a bit of strife regarding the Division of Revenue bill, which saw the Senate against the National Assembly with regard to allocations. So these are issues which the budget cycle in this year has really tried to streamline to ensure that there's no delay in terms of the planned expenditure. And of course, this is an environment where there is need for stimulus within the economy. I should remind you that the March 2020 stimulus aggregates to about 32 billion shillings. Now the government has announced another 53.7, which it terms as post-COVID stimulus package. That takes it aggregate to about close to about 90 billion shillings. But just coming back to studio where we have Fred Omondi. Fred, when you look at the budget cycle this year, unique in its own sense, as I've said, we haven't had the finance bill ever coming before as early as we have seen it this year. Do you think this has done anything to streamline the process, or it's just the same as it was?
In terms of the advantage of that is that previously, if you remember, we had controversy around when some of the budget measures took effect, and Bwana Omkia Mtata actually went to court and managed to stop some of the measures because the date that had been pronounced during the budget statement came before the actual process of debate and assent to the bill had been completed. So in terms of making the process work in a better way, we think it's good for the measures to be released in advance, and so that the public can have sufficient time for input, Parliament can have sufficient time to interrogate them, and probably take in the relevant changes. And then there's time to then, pass it through the parliamentary process, have it assented to in good time before the measures actually take effect. Because what used to happen in the past was, those of us who have been following this can recall, was that the measures were announced, let's say today, and then they were effective midnight. So if you needed even to change your systems as a business, then that was really problematic, Well, some of the measures, the businesses were given some time, but then you found when there's a radical change, it still takes time to even change your systems or to be able to prepare to actually implement the new taxes. So we think this is positive in that sense. However, it could also have been informed by the fact that a number of the changes had already come earlier through the Tax Laws Amendment Act, which was in response to the impact of COVID. And therefore, we do not expect a lot of changes in the current budget in terms of taxation. Yes, there are some new measures that have been proposed. And interestingly, some of the measures that were rejected at the tax laws amendment stage have been reintroduced. So I'll be keen to see how Parliament handles that, because it really sends the wrong picture that they didn't know what they were doing when they rejected them, and the Treasury has put them right back in. So we think that should be relooked at, and Parliament should maybe take a firm stance on that. So that would be my take on the process.
But Fred, and still on this matter of some of the measures which were rejected by Parliament, clearly we have observed they've actually been reintroduced with regard to this. And when I was interviewing the Treasury Cabinet Secretary about 2 weeks ago, he did indicate to me that Kenyans need to be pragmatic with themselves and appreciate that these are not ordinary circumstances. Surely there must be a way of raising revenue in spite of the circumstances. A proposal, for example, like taxation of the senior citizens, which has been very controversial. Where else do you think the government could source for revenue? Or maybe should I ask, rationalize its expenditure? Because clearly it is with its backs against the wall.
Yeah, thanks. So even though the government is a big system, and we all know how huge the government is, but the basic principles that apply to you as an individual, to a business, also do apply to the government. So what we are saying is, if you have a certain income, and maybe you see that income is going to be reduced, then what are your options, So as an individual, I think the first step you'd think about is, where can I reduce my expenditure? Where can I cut back on my expenditure? So the same question the government should then be looking at, where can we reduce expenditure? Where can we cut expenditure? And some areas are obvious in the current environment. For example, nobody's traveling. So some of these travels and benchmarking tours, as we know them, some of those could be, cut back significantly, because it won't impact really the day-to-day operations of the government. There are other areas of possible, wastages or leakages that could be reduced. So you start by, trying to cut back on your expenditure. Of course, the other option, which is more controversial given the situation we are in, and it's an interesting analogy, because with COVID-19, we all know that if you have pre-existing conditions, then you'll even be impacted much harder by the disease. So in terms of our own situation, we had some pre-existing conditions. One being, the high level of debt.
Yes.
So in terms of having an option to borrow more, maybe that will be not as feasible as it would have been if our debt levels were a little bit lower. So that is one of the options still. You've seen the IMF extending, additional credit to the government to try and address the immediate challenges and to support budget implementation. So it could be that, there'll be some additional borrowing that they'll then use to plug in the deficit. But as we know, that has to be weighed against the debt sustainability, because when you borrow more, you are simply pushing the can down the road.
Yes.
And you and I will have to pay back in future, one way or the other. And debt payment is already taking up a big part of our budget allocation, or even our revenue, as it were. So that is one of the other options. As a business, or even as institutions, when we are faced with hard times, we also restructure certain of our operations. So one of the things I would be hoping, and I know it's a topic that is now quite current, is as we go into the constitutional debate, for example, can we look at how to restructure the structure of government in a way that could save us some costs? Because many have asked, whether do we need all the 42 counties, for example?
47.
Yeah, 47, sorry, for example. So there are certain ways we need to look at how could we probably restructure the government for more efficiency, to save us on some of these costs. And these are hard decisions, so they are not definitely things that are easy to do. But I guess the current circumstances then call us to relook at things beyond the ordinary, to be able to survive, but also set up ourselves for better growth in the future.
I see. And Fred, suppose that you were the cabinet secretary and you were in Ukur Yatani's shoes at this particular point. What sort of balance would be going on through your mind by way of balancing revenue and expenditure? I'm just trying to imagine, if you were in that situation, what, for example, would be your priorities?
So it's to focus on things that will relieve, taxpayers, businesses of the immediate pain, and things that are a priority for the government and the country as a whole. Of course, top on everybody's mind is health. I mean, the pandemic has taught us that we have to be prepared. We have to have a system that works in case, for everybody when we need it. So investment in health will be a priority for sure. Investment in food security and mitigating the impact on the most vulnerable. And the government is already doing some of this. So I'm not saying they're not doing it. We've seen that they're saying that they'll increase the amount of subsidies that they send to the vulnerable households. The Ministry of Labour has already identified some of the people who've lost their jobs who could potentially be receiving some of these subsidies from the government.
Yes.
So focus on those priority expenditure and cut back on anything that is not high priority at the moment. Of course, everything can be a priority, but then you have to see what is the immediate need. So one area which is likely to suffer, maybe debatable what the impact of that will be in the long term, but one area which is likely to suffer is capital expenditure. So we are likely to see cutback in terms of capital projects, significant projects that like roads or other major projects that would otherwise have been in the program. But still, even this should not be shut down completely, because there are certain frameworks which have been put in place, like PPP, public-private partnership, that could still be used to be able to undertake some of those projects.
Okay.
But that is likely to suffer in the short term as the minister tries to balance the gap. One other measure which is probably not written in the text of the law, but is an administrative measure, is we are likely to see the Revenue Authority being more aggressive in terms of everybody complying with their tax obligations in a bid to be able to raise more revenue. So all taxpayers should expect that they'll be seeing the Revenue Authority knocking more aggressively on their doors, seeking for them to pay up, whatever is due to the exchequer.
I see. Yeah. And I'm told Muthoni is back. Muthoni, if you can hear me, moving on to the subject of debt, of course, the numbers are quite high when you look at the debt servicing obligations we have in the next financial year. Do you see there is ample room for Kenya to go back to the negotiating table with its creditors to try and seek some relief in the coming financial year?
Yes, I think it would be foolhardy not to start negotiating for both the restructuring as well as maybe much more fundamental changes including the debt being forgiven. I know there are certain reasons why the minister said we have not approached that, and part of it is because of our category, I think being an MIC, rather than at the bottom of the poorest countries. But I think there is room for that negotiation. But the first stage is the restructuring. And then remembering that even restructuring means the debt finally will have to be paid. And the real issue we have is the issue of the GDP. Because the GDP growth is not able to do the things we want done. One would be able to afford those large infrastructure projects, as well as to move people from poverty or to get to a better income. And I think originally the target was to have a double-digit growth in GDP. And this is not an impossible task. I think we got to 8 point something somewhere in the last 6-7 years. So to get the other 2% would be quite easy, because we do have some industries, for example, agriculture, which is has some very many, low fruits. For example, if we reduce the post-harvest losses, we'd probably boost our GDP by one. If we manage to produce the basic foods that we're importing, we'd do another 3-4%. So essentially, if we should focus on the things which can grow our GDP, and the selection of the Agenda 4 items, especially the issue of agriculture and manufacturing, that is a beginning point, because we really have not scratched those industries in terms of contribution to GDP. And then there is the issue of tourism. Tourism seems to get very little incentive. Even now, the allocation for the stimulus is very low, and yet it's an industry which has a very high potential. I think the contribution last year was like 163 billion. It was the second highest foreign exchange bringer into the country.
Yes.
And just a small investment in that, particularly in marketing and supporting the service which we have here, it would give us another maybe 10-20% of in the industry, and maybe a contribution of 4% to the GDP. Thank you.
Muthoni, thank you for that. And just to take you back to our live pictures where the CS for National Treasury, Ukur Yatani, has arrived in Parliament. And you can see him there with the Majority Leader, Eden Duale, and other legislators as well. At this point, I'd like to hand you over to my colleague, Alex Mwangi, who's on the ground, to at least give us a sense of how it will be progressing beyond this point. Alex, if you can hear me, what do we expect beyond this? Yes, you can see CS Ukur Yatani there with the chairperson, the outgoing chairperson, I should say, there for the Budget and Appropriations Committee. That is the Kikuyu Member of Parliament, Kimani Ichung'wah, who last week on Thursday tabled the Budget and Appropriations Committee on some of the estimates which had been submitted by the National Treasury, and giving feedback, and largely on a very conservative tone, telling the National Treasury that some of their targets were indeed over-ambitious, especially in light of the situation that we are facing presently. The Budget and Appropriations Committee also interestingly proposed that the management of the COVID-19 Emergency Fund be taken away from the National Treasury and be placed under the National Assembly, and this is cited as a need for more oversight as far as how these funds are deployed, and therefore we wait to see whether some of the feedback that was given by this committee is indeed incorporated in the budget statement, which should be tabled shortly. Alex Mwangi, if you can hear me, what do we expect beyond this point?
Okay, beyond this point, we just been taking the customized photographs with the leaders of either budget committee or the leader of the majority and the minority. And from here, we expect that the CS will walk right into Parliament as he is actually doing just now. And in a few minutes, then we do expect that he's going to begin reading the budget, and it's first ever budget that is going to read during a pandemic, making it a unique situation because even the coverage of this budget is quite different from what we normally do. And right now, the CS is entering the building accompanied by other officials of the government.
And I apologize for the quality of that audio. We'll be getting back to Alex as and when we can get him in a more clear sense. But shortly, we'll be expecting some action on the floor of the House. As you can see on your screens, this seems to be the last preparations just before the members walk in, as well as the Cabinet Secretary, are ready to table the budget for the financial year 2020-2021. But coming back to studio, and Fred, Muthoni had already touched on this subject of debt, and I'm really curious to know what your thoughts are. Of course, the Treasury has expressed concern that should it now go and seek some debt relief, it is likely to hurt Kenya's credit ratings. But from where I sit, already an agency such as Moody's has downgraded Kenya.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
You're right. So the issue of debt is one that is continuing to receive a lot of attention because there's a lot of concern as to whether our debt is sustainable. Of course, opinion is divided, and the minister and the Treasury is confident that our debt levels are still sustainable, and comparisons have been made, to some developed economies like Japan, the US, and other countries. So yes, it's a question of circumstances again. So the absolute percentages may indicate that we are still within the sustainability range. But I think the issue then is, how our economic growth is projected to be. So as Muthoni mentioned earlier, under the Vision 2030, the ambition was to have double-digit economic growth, but this has not been realized. So we keep growing in the range of, let's say, 4 to 6, 7%. And looking at this, then it means a significant chunk of our revenue is going to debt repayment year after year. And the more debt we take on, then the more we squeeze on other expenditures or other priority areas that the government would be funding from the revenue that they obtain. So it's one area that needs a very delicate balance in that, yes, debt could be available, and we've seen government going even into the commercial market to borrow, and that's where the rating could have an impact, because some of these terms provided under non-concessionary borrowing requires that we comply with certain parameters, and therefore if there's a default, then the implications could be very significant for the government in terms of the lenders maybe seeking to enforce collection of their debt. So the minister has then to tread carefully to make sure that we continue paying our obligations. But I think there are those bilateral arrangements and those debt by some of the key partners like China, for example, which is very significant, that the minister could probably negotiate with them. But in terms of the commercial debt, then there's very little scope for that. Let me just hold you there.
We can see the majority leader for the National Assembly is speaking. Let's listen in.
Bill 2020 ought to be passed and ready for assent by His Excellency the President by the 30th of June 2020, in accordance with the provisions of the Public Finance Management Act 2012, as amended by the House last year. And it's for this reason that the House Business Committee has given priority for these bills to be considered before the end of the month. Mr. Speaker, within the same week, the House Business Committee has also set to consider two bills. One, the mediated version of the County Government Amendment Bill, Senate Bill number 11 of 2017, the mediated version of the County Government Amendment Bill, Senate Bill number 7 of 2017, as well as the second reading of the Refugee Bill 2019 and the Committee of the Whole House of the T Bill, Senate Bill number 36 of 2018. Honorable Speaker, finally, the House Business Committee will reconvene on Thursday, 18th June 2020, to consider business for the coming week. I now wish to lay this statement on the table of the House, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Very well. We proceed now with the motion by the Honorable Maore, but just to alert you that you will have, the motion has only a maximum of 8 minutes from now. Proceed.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that pursuant to the provisions and Regulation 510 of the National Government Constituency Development Fund 2015, this House approves the list of nominees for the appointment to the following 17 constituency committees of the National Government Constituency Development Fund, laid on the table of this House on Thursday, June the 4th, 2020. 1, Berwood constituency, Bobazi constituency, Bomet Central constituency, Bumula constituency, Dagoretti North constituency, Galole constituency, Gem, Ijara, Isiolo North, Kabondo Kaspul, Kadui, Kiharu, Kilifi North, Ruiru, Samburu North, and Seme. Mr. Speaker, you will find that this is a lot that was presented on June the 4th, and we have been doing the approvals for the various constituency development boards, and we are behind the time we had sought for extension for the House to approve the boards that have been appointed or nominated by the various constituencies in the country. So, Mr. Speaker, it is not a complicated motion. The members that need to sit and approve the operations of those constituency development committees are needed urgently. And it is at this point, Mr. Speaker, I wish to state that we need these committees in place as quickly as possible so that those members or those constituencies can be able to utilize the funds that we are sending from Nairobi. Mr. Speaker, it is not, it's just like whereby the board has gone through the technical requirements for each and every member on different categories, and it is not complicated unless somebody from the floor can raise an objection to a specific constituency. Mr. Speaker, I would plead that this House does approve these 17 constituencies for the membership into those boards. And at this point, Mr. Speaker, I beg to move and seek to have a member of the committee second the motion, the Chief Whip, and then we can continue.
Honorable
Yes,
Wangwe.
Honorable Wangwe has been a member of this committee.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, I rise to second the motion as moved by the chair. Honorable Speaker, this being a list of members, list of committee members from various constituencies, they have already been checked, verified, and ascertained by the individual members from those constituencies, Honorable Speaker, who are also members of this House. Therefore, approving them will enable the various constituencies to enjoy the benefits that come along with the CDF from the various constituencies, Honorable Speaker. For that matter, I second.
Honourable members, I propose the question, which is that pursuant to the provisions of Section 43, subsection 4, and Regulation 5, subregulation 10 of the National Government Constituencies Development Fund 2015, this House approves the list of nominees for appointment to the following 17 constituency committees of the National Government Constituency Development Fund, laid to the table of the House on Thursday, June 4th, 2020. Constituencies being Belgut, Bobasi, Bomet Central, Bumula, Dagoretti North, Galole, Gem, Ijara, Isiolo North Constituency, Kabondo Kaspul, Kadui, Kiharu, North, Mwingi Central, Ruiru, Samburu North, and Seme constituency. Is the desire of the House that I put the question? Members, I put the question that pursuant to the provisions of Section 43, subsection 4 of the and Regulation 5, subregulation 10 of the National Government Constituency Development Fund 2015, this House approves the list of the nominees for appointment to the 17 constituencies named on the order paper, laid on the table of the House on Thursday, June 4th, 2020. Will as many as that opinion say aye? Will as many as the contrary opinion say nay? The ayes have it. Just check if it's there. I can then make the communication. I'm reading this one. Yeah, let them come in. Honourable members, I wish to interrupt the business. As you are aware, on Tuesday, 9th of June 2020, this House approved the report of the Budget and Appropriations Committee on the budget estimates for the national government, the judiciary, and Parliament for the financial year 2020-2021. The next phase in the budget approval process will be consideration of the estimates in the Committee of Supply, which will allocate funds to various votes and programs for the respective three arms of the national government. Honourable members, as part of the process, before the supply phase is concluded, Section 40, Subsection 1 of the Public Finance Management Act 2012, read together with our Standing Order 244C, require the Cabinet Secretary for National Treasury to make a public pronouncement of the budget highlights and revenue-raising measures of the national government. It is for this reason that I will now interrupt the business of the House this afternoon, not later than 3 p.m., to allow the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury and Planning to discharge this obligation. However, honourable members, unlike the previous years and in keeping with the Speaker's guidelines on the conduct of plenary sittings during the COVID-19 pandemic period, issued on 2nd and 11th of April this year, you will note that today's event is unique, as the House is unable to accommodate the usual invited guests and other dignitaries to witness the event live from our galleries. We have a few exceptions, though. In this regard, I wish to recognize the few officials from the Ministry of National Treasury and Planning and other guests accompanying the Cabinet Secretary this afternoon. They are seated at the public servants' bench, the diplomatic boxes, and the Speaker's gallery. The officials include the Chief Administrative Secretary, National Treasury and Planning, the Honourable Nelson Gaishoye, the Principal Secretary, National Planning, Dr. Julius Muia, CBS, the Principal Secretary, National Treasury and Planning, Mr. Saitot Torome, the Principal Administrative Secretary, National Treasury and Planning, Mr. Amos Gadesha, amongst other officials and guests. They are welcome to the National Assembly this afternoon. Honourable members, Standing Order number 25A, paragraph A, provides that, and I quote, the Speaker may designate a suitable place in the chamber or at the bar of the House for the Cabinet Secretary responsible for finance to make a public pronouncement of the budget policy highlights and revenue-raising measures for the national government as contemplated under the Public Finance Management Act, close the quotes. Honourable members, in furtherance of this provision, I have designated a suitable place to the right of the Speaker's seat and adjacent to the public servants' benches to enable the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury discharge his obligation under Section 40 of the Public Finance Management Act 2012 and our Standing Order 244C of the National Assembly Standing Orders. It's now my pleasure, therefore, to invite the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury and Planning, the Honourable Ambassador Ukur Yatan, to make a public pronouncement of the budget highlights and revenue-raising measures for the national government for the financial year 2020-2021 and the medium term. Cabinet Secretary, karibu.
Mr. Speaker, honorable members and fellow Kenyans, It's a great honor to present to this August House and to the country the highlights of the budget for the financial year 2020-21. I do this in performing my fiduciary duty and fulfillment of the requirements of Section 40 of the Public Finance Management Act 2012 and the Standing Order number 241 of the National Assembly. Mr. Speaker, at the outset, allow me to take this early opportunity to express my sincere gratitude to His Excellency the President of the Republic of Kenya, Honorable Uhuru Kenyatta, for appointing me to the position of the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury and Planning to provide leadership in the economic and financial affairs of the country. Mr. Speaker, allow me also to express my deep appreciation to the Chair and members of the Budget and Appropriation Committee, Finance and National Planning Committee, as well as the departmental committees of the National Assembly for their constructive engagement and support in the review of the financial year 2020-21 budget estimates and the financing measures. Mr. Speaker, in February 2020, we submitted to this House the 2020 budget policy statement. During that time, our financial projections assumed a normal operating environment. The economy was projected to grow by 6.1% in 2020, which was an improvement from 5.4% in 2019. Indeed, we had set on a conscious journey of fiscal consolidation, targeting a lower fiscal deficit of 6.3% of GDP in the financial year 2019-2020, 4.9% of GDP in 2020-21, and ultimately 3.0% of GDP over the medium term. This plan was premised on a strong revenue growth, reduction of non-core expenditures, and a gradual slowdown in the growth of the public debt. Mr. Speaker, you may recall that early in the year, this House considered our proposals and approved the economic and financial strategies in the 2020 budget policy statement. Mr. Speaker, the global outbreak and the rapid spread of the COVID-19 pandemic has led to the contraction of the global economy with disastrous consequences. The pandemic and the attendant containment measures aimed at saving lives have disrupted the business environment, including international trade, leading to loss of livelihoods for millions of people globally. Mr. Speaker, Kenya has not been spared. Evidently, the pandemic and the swift containment measures, including the closure of the airspaces and borders, curfews and cessation of movements in some counties, among others, have not only disrupted our ways of lives and livelihoods, but to a great extent, business. These measures, including enforcement of basic hygiene and social distancing, were not only necessary but also timely, as they have indeed stemmed a surge of infections and loss of lives. In addition to the adverse effect of COVID-19 pandemic, our economy also experienced two other shocks. First, the massive invasion of swarms of desert locusts that damaged crops. Secondly, the floods that led to loss of lives and livelihoods, displacement of people, and destruction of infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, cognizant of the magnitude of the multiple challenges, particularly the COVID-19 pandemic, the government moved swiftly to intervene and implement a range of measures to mitigate against the adverse effects. Overall, these measures have provided the much-needed relief to the economy through injection of cash and provision of additional disposable incomes to the people and businesses. Mr. Speaker, the government also lowered the value-added tax rate from 16% to 14%, reduced tax rates from both corporate and personal income from 30% to 25%, and provided 100% tax relief for persons earning a gross monthly income of up to 24,000 Kenya shilling. Further, in order to support the micro, small, and medium enterprises, the turnover tax rate was lowered from 3% to 1%. Mr. Speaker, in order to support the economy, the government instituted various monetary policy measures to enhance credit access by the private sector at an affordable cost. This was achieved through introduction of central bank rates from 8.25% to 7% and lowering of the cash reserve ratio requirement from 5.2% to 4.25%. Consequently, this intervention released Kenya shilling 35 billion to commercial banks, allowing them flexibility with regard to requirements for loan classification and disposition. Indeed, since March 2020, banks have restructured loans in excess of Kenya shilling 360 billion, including Kenya shilling 190 billion of personal loans. Further, Mr. Speaker, listing with the credit reference bureaus of any person, micro, small, and medium enterprises, and corporate entities whose loan account falls overdue or is in arrears was temporarily suspended. In addition, in order to enhance liquidity for business, the government provided Kenya shilling 13.1 billion to settle verified pending bills owed by ministries and departments, and a further Kenya shilling 10 billion for payment of verified VAT refund claims. Mr. Speaker, to cushion the vulnerable in our society, particularly the emerging urban vulnerable, the government provided an additional Kenya shilling 10 billion to boost the ongoing traditional current cash transfer program. Similarly, the government allocated Kenya shilling 1 billion to recruit health workers to strengthen the health capital capacity of the Ministry of Health, while allocating Kenya shilling 400 million for food and non-food commodities for affected households. Mr. Speaker, the government also established the COVID-19 Emergency Response Fund to receive voluntary contributions from well-wishers towards defraying expenses associated with this pandemic. Mr. Speaker, in order to gainfully engage our youth, the government rolled out the Kazi Mtaani program designed to improve public hygiene standards and undertake urban civil works. Already, 26,000 youth are engaged in the pilot phase. To further cushion citizens and business from the adverse effects of COVID-19 pandemic and to stimulate economic activity going forward, His Excellency the President, on May 23, 2020, unveiled an 8-point economic stimulus program. I'll be elaborating on the economic stimulus program later in my statement. Mr. Speaker, over the last few months, revenue collections shrank considerably due to slowed economic activities attributed to COVID-19 pandemic. Conversely, there was a rise in public expenditures to address the targeted interventions. In light of this, the government reached out to the multilateral and bilateral development partners for additional funding. Indeed, the response from the development partners was prompt and also generous. A number of them provided assistance in form of grants and highly concessional funds and personal protective equipment. Mr. Speaker, allow me to highlight some of the significant financial assistance that Kenya has received from multilateral partners. First, the country received Kenya shilling 78.3 billion under the Rapid Credit Facility of the International Monetary Fund to help address the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. This financial support is fully concessional at zero interest rate. Second, we received Kenya shilling 108 billion from the World Bank under the second development policy operation as both budgetary support and extra resources to help fight the pandemic. At the initial phase of the COVID-19 outbreak, the World Bank extended support of Kenya shilling 6.8 billion under the contingency emergency response to the Ministry of Health for prompt preparation and response. Mr. Speaker, the government has also received Kenya shilling 22.5 billion from the African Development Bank as a concessional loan, an additional Kenya shilling 7.5 billion commitments from the European Union in form of grants. With this support, Mr. Speaker, will not only strengthen our healthcare systems with the requisite equipment, supplies, and medical personnel to respond to the pandemic, but also fund other critical interventions in the budget. We express our sincere gratitude to our bilateral development partners and multilateral institutions for standing with us during this challenging time. Mr. Speaker, the financial year 2020-21 budget responds to the current challenges facing Kenyans, businesses, and the economy at large in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic. It's in this context that we have chosen the theme for this budget as stimulating the economy to safeguard livelihoods, jobs, businesses, and industrial recovery. The theme underscores our determination to protect lives and livelihoods and cushion vulnerable citizens against the adverse effects of COVID-19. This is further expected to create and protect jobs, stimulate industrial growth, and ultimately steer economic recovery. Mr. Speaker, to sustain efforts towards the full recovery of the economy, the government is currently developing a post-COVID-19 economic recovery strategy under the leadership of His Excellency the President. The strategy will not only accelerate economic recovery, but is designed to provide a roadmap for transition to a new development framework beyond the current Vision 2030. Mr. Speaker, allow me now to highlight the economic policy context in which this budget has been prepared. Mr. Speaker, in framing this budget, we have taken into account recent economic developments on the global and domestic scene. The budget was prepared against a background of a contracting global economy occasioned by the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has disrupted most aspects of human life. Indeed, most world economies remain on lockdown. As a result, in April 2020, the IMF projected that the world economy will experience negative growth rate of 3% in 2020. This is worse than the growth rate reported during the 2008 and 2009 financial crisis. However, on a positive note, world economic growth is projected to rebound to 5.8% in 2021. Mr. Speaker, overall, economic growth in advanced economies is projected to contract by 6.1% in 2020, while that of emerging and developing countries, including China, India, Russia, and Brazil, is expected to contract by 1% in 2020. Equally, economies in sub-Saharan Africa region are projected to contract by 1.6% in 2020 before a rebound to grow by 4.1% in 2021. Mr. Speaker, in addition to the adverse effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Kenyan economy is confronted by the impact of desert locusts and floods that have caused deaths, displacement, and destruction of infrastructure across the country. From these three simultaneous shocks, all sectors of the economy have been adversely affected. Agricultural sector, for example, has been hit hard by the low global demand for agricultural products, especially horticulture, tea, and coffee, among others. Further, the reduction in availability of raw materials and intermediate goods following closure of international borders has negatively affected the manufacturing sector. Mr. Speaker, taking into account the impact of these shocks on the domestic economy, growth is now projected at a lower rate of 2.5% in 2020, down from 5.4% growth recorded in 2019. Moving forward, so as to boost economic activities and foster higher growth rates, we shall not only implement a rapid economic stimulus program, but also lay down a firm post-COVID-19 economic recovery strategy. These initiatives are ultimately expected to stimulate economic activities, thereby culminating to a growth of 5.8% in 2021 and 6.5% by 2024. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned earlier, our chosen fiscal consolidation plan has been adversely affected by the events over the last 6 months. In this respect, we are now targeting a fiscal deficit of 8.3% of GDP in financial year 2019-2020, from the previous target of 6.3% of GDP. In the financial year 2020-21, the fiscal deficit is targeted at 7.5% of GDP and is expected to improve to 6.1% of GDP in financial year 2021-22. Mr. Speaker, having outlined the economic policy context for this budget, the rest of my statement will outline specific measures aimed at stimulating the economy so as to safeguard livelihoods, including jobs, businesses, and facilitate faster industrial recovery. I will thereafter present a fiscal framework that sets out the resource envelope underpinning this budget and enumerate spending priorities. Finally, I'll provide highlights of tax and other policy measures that we are proposing to support economic recovery. Mr. Speaker, in addition to the recent shocks experienced by the economy, we are still confronted by the perennial challenges of high incidence of poverty and unemployment, frequent droughts, low agricultural and industrial productivity, inadequate decent housing, growing demands for high investment in the health sector, inadequate revenue, and other forms of financing and governance-related issues. Mr. Speaker, these challenges, including the devastating effects of COVID-19 pandemic, require bold actions if we are to position our country on a sustainable economic growth trajectory. Through this budget, therefore, Mr. Speaker, our focus will be, first, to roll out an economic stimulus program that will catalyze economic activity, provide livelihoods to Kenyans, and enable businesses to recover from the adverse effects of COVID-19 pandemic. I will shortly enumerate the various initiatives under their funding. Second, maintaining macroeconomic stability to support long-term investments, economic growth, and development. Towards this end, we aim to strike an appropriate balance between support for economic recovery and continued fiscal discipline. This will be achieved through effective coordination of fiscal, monetary, and financial policies to lower the cost of living and doing business. Mr. Speaker, whereas Kenya's public debt remains sustainable, we need to be cautious about future debt accumulation. Our focus, therefore, will be to strengthen management of public debt to minimize costs and risk of the portfolio, while accessing external concessional funding to finance development projects. Further, Mr. Speaker, I reiterate that security of our people, property and investments remain key. In this regard, I'll be proposing allocation of funds to strengthen our security and investigative agencies. This is because a secure and conducive business environment will attract foreign direct investment that is necessary for economic recovery. Third, to support the recovery and growth of micro, small, and medium enterprises through various interventions, including operationalization of the Credit Guarantee Scheme. Mr. Speaker, to further expand opportunities for local enterprises and micro, small, and medium enterprises, we shall gazette and enforce the list of items for local procurement to promote the Buy Kenya, Build Kenya initiative. Fourth, to continue supporting implementation of the Big Four agenda. In this regard, therefore, Mr. Speaker, I will later in this statement be proposing allocations to the drivers and enablers of the Big Four agenda. Fifth, enhance allocations to support development of critical infrastructure in the country, such as roads, rail, energy, and water, among others, so as to reduce the cost of doing business, as well as promote competitiveness. Sixth, increase resources to support the youth, women, and persons with disability to enable them actively contribute to economic recovery agenda. Seven, to scale up resource allocation to improve access to education, strengthen healthcare systems, and enhance cash transfers to support the vulnerable members of our society. Eighth, continue to facilitate county governments in strengthening their system to enhance service delivery. In this respect, I urge county governments which have not completed paying verified pending bills or to various suppliers to do so expeditiously. And ninth, implement various structural reforms to enhance the efficiency of public service delivery, while at the same time ensuring accountability for sustained macroeconomic and fiscal stability, better credit ratings, improve fiscal discipline, and minimize corruption. Mr. Speaker, allow me at this point to elaborate on the 8-point economic stimulus program that the government will be implementing to stimulate and sustain economic activities. I will thereafter briefly highlight plans for developing the post-COVID-19 economic recovery strategy, which is linked to the post-2030 vision. Mr. Speaker, the 8-point economic stimulus program targets to cushion vulnerable citizens and businesses, particularly those affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. The stimulus program will focus on keeping the food supply chains functional while promoting the use of locally produced goods and services, thus securing the livelihoods of daily wage earners. Mr. Speaker, we have set aside Kenya shilling 56.6 billion to cater for the various thematic areas of the program. Mr. Speaker, in the first theme covers the infrastructure and is designed to rehabilitate road networks across the country as a direct response to the damages occasioned by the recent heavy rains. The rehabilitation of access roads and footbridges will optimize the use of local labor and materials, thereby generating short-term employment for thousands of youth. Towards this end, I propose to allocate Kenya shilling 5 billion for rehabilitation of the damaged access roads and footbridges. Further, Mr. Speaker, to address the issue of youth unemployment and empowerment in urban informal settlement, I have set aside Kenya shilling 10 billion under the Kazi Mtaani program. This Kazi Mtaani program will be targeting unemployed youth in the major cities and urban settlements of Nairobi, Mombasa, Kisumu, Eldoret, Nakuru, and other major towns across the country. The youth will be engaged in fumigation, stormwater drainage works, cleaning of markets and informal settlements, rehabilitation and maintenance of access roads, footbridges and footpaths, and other environmental management activities. The Kazi Mtaani program targets to employ at least 200,000 youth. Mr. Speaker, The second theme seeks to improve education outcomes in the country. The objective is to get thousands of unemployed teachers off the bench and into action as intern teachers, while also supporting local artisans and builders' businesses. To meet this commitment, Kenya shilling 7.4 billion has been proposed. Mr. Speaker, out of these, Kenya shilling 2.1 billion will go to construction of additional classrooms in secondary schools. Kenya shilling 1.9 billion for provision of at least 250,000 locally fabricated desks for secondary and primary schools. Kenya shilling 700 million for capitation and improvement of infrastructure in low-cost boarding schools in arid and semi-arid lands using local labor. Kenya shilling 2.4 billion for recruitment of 10,000 intern teachers to support the 100% transition schools, and Kenya shilling 300 million for recruitment of 1,000 ICT interns to support digital learning in public schools. Mr. Speaker, the third theme targets to support micro, small, and medium enterprises. Despite their important contribution, this sector has continued to face challenges of accessing credit due to lack of sufficient collateral, high cost of credit, and informal business structure. These challenges have been worsened by the COVID-19 pandemic. With the reduced turnover and disruptions in the market and supply chains, many micro, small, medium enterprises are unlikely to attract affordable and quality credit under the traditional arrangements. Mr. Speaker, in order to de-risk lending to the micro, small, and medium enterprise, I have set aside shilling 3 billion seed capital to operationalize the credit guarantee scheme. The scheme will enable the provision of affordable credit in an efficient and structured manner. In addition to this, we are also actively engaging a number of development agencies who have shown willingness to put in additional resources to support this scheme. Mr. Speaker, to further support and enhance the liquidity of these enterprises, I propose to fast-track payment of outstanding verified VAT refund claims and pending bills owed to businesses by allocating shilling 10 billion. This is in addition to the shilling 23.1 billion approved by this House in April 2020 in the supplementary budget for the same purpose. Mr. Speaker, the fourth theme prioritizes improvement in health outcomes. Evidently, the COVID-19 pandemic has overstretched our healthcare system. The government has made significant efforts to contain the spread of the virus through various protocols and containment measures, which entail promotion of hygiene and restriction of movements. Mr. Speaker, building on these measures in a way that ensures more Kenyans are gainfully engaged and support local industries, and to further enhance capacity of the healthcare system, shilling 1.2 billion is proposed for the recruitment of an additional cohort of 5,000 healthcare workers to support local health staff for a period of 1 year. This will enhance our COVID-19 response capabilities and strengthen implementation of the Universal Health Coverage Program. Mr. Speaker, we have also allocated an additional shilling 500 million to supply 20,000 locally made beds and beddings to public hospitals, and shilling 25 million to support the establishment of 50 modern walk-through sanitizers at our border points and main hospitals across the country. Mr. Speaker, the fifth theme will focus on agriculture and food security. I have set aside shilling 3 billion to subsidize the supply of farm inputs through the e-voucher system to reach 200,000 small-scale farmers. I have also allocated shilling 3.5 billion for expanded community household irrigation. These will caution farmers from the adverse effects of weather and further secure food supply chains. Further, Mr. Speaker, I have set aside shilling 1.5 billion to assist flower and horticultural farmers to access international market during this period when we are experiencing low cargo traffic in and out of the country. These interventions will support and sustain the farming communities as they will provide employment to thousands of workers in our agricultural sector. Mr. Speaker, the sixth theme for the program is to support the tourism sector. Tourism is one of the worst hit sectors by the pandemic. This is reflected by massive cancellation of hotel bookings occasioned by lockdown and travel bans imposed by various countries in an effort to minimize the spread of the virus. The resultant effect has been massive job and income losses by many Kenyans directly and indirectly employed in the tourism sector. In this regard, Mr. Speaker, to support this critical sector, the government has initiated a number of urgent measures, including a temporary lifting of the ban to hold meetings in private hotels by government agencies. The government has also waived landing and parking fees at our airports in order to facilitate movement of cargo in and out of Kenya. Going forward, Mr. Speaker, the government will scale up efforts to boost the tourism sector by promoting aggressive post-COVID-19 tourism marketing and providing support for hotel refurbishment through soft loans to be channeled through the Tourism Finance Corporation. Kenya shilling 3 billion has been set aside to support the renovation of facilities and the restructuring of business operations by actors in this industry. Mr. Speaker, the government will also provide grants to 160 community conservancies and support to Kenya Wildlife Services to engage 5,500 community scouts for a period of 1 year. To support these initiatives, I propose to set aside Kenya 2 billion in this budget. Mr. Speaker, the seventh theme seeks to improve environment, water and sanitation facilities, as well as mitigate the adverse effects of floods. On these, I have set aside Kenya 1 billion to support flood control using local labor in the most affected areas. I have also set aside Kenya 850 million to cater for rehabilitation of wells, water pumps, and underground tanks in nasal areas using local labor, and Kenya 540 million to enhance tree planting program across the country using locally sourced seedlings. Mr. Speaker, the eighth and the final theme of the stimulus program is manufacturing. In this area, the government will promote the Buy Kenya, Build Kenya policy. To this end, we propose an initial investment of Kenya 600 million to purchase locally assembled vehicles. These will sustain the operation of local motor vehicle manufacturers, which is aimed at safeguarding jobs. Mr. Speaker, I further propose an allocation of Kenya 712 million to provide credit targeted to micro, small, and medium enterprises in the manufacturing sector. Mr. Speaker, in addition to implementing the economic stimulus program that I have enumerated, the government is formulating a post-COVID-19 economic recovery strategy to mitigate the adverse impacts on the economy and further reposition the economy on a steady and sustainable growth trajectory. Mr. Speaker, the post-COVID economic recovery strategy will focus on the following. 1, sound macroeconomic policy framework to support a higher sustainable economic growth that will address the challenges of poverty, unemployment, and income inequality. 2, adequate local and foreign resource mobilization to ensure sustainable funding of our development programs. 3, enhancing the role of the private sector in the economy, including financing infrastructure projects from diverse sources such as public-private partnership and lease financing. 4, supporting micro, small, and medium enterprises by facilitating access to adequate finances through credit guarantee scheme. 5, full and timely implementation of the economic stimulus program, which will create jobs and stimulate business. 6, investment in the ICT and digital infrastructure to support the use of digital platforms to facilitate e-commerce and efficient delivery of public services. 7, promotion of local production of processes and domestic supply value chains. 8, enhancement of disaster risk management systems. 9, improvement of social protection through targeted policy interventions and programs. And 10, strengthening monitoring and evaluation systems for quality outcomes of the project. Mr. Speaker, in preparing the post-COVID-19 economic recovery strategy, we will ensure the process is all-inclusive. To this end, we'll draw inputs and ideas from diverse groups, including experts from both county and national government, private sector, development partners, academia, and research institutions, and other relevant stakeholders. Mr. Speaker, it's also important to note that we are less than 10 years to the end of our long-term development blueprint, the Kenya Vision 2030. As we conclude this implementation, we need to think of the next development framework for this country. In this respect, Mr. Speaker, the preparation of the next long-term development plan will benefit from this post-COVID-19 economic recovery strategy. The new plan, beyond the Kenya Vision 2030, will take cognizance of the transition of sustainable development goals, of United Nations and the African Union Agenda 2063. This will be a precursor to 100 years of Kenya's independence celebration. Mr. Speaker, to improve the business environment, increase efficiency in public service delivery, and enhance accountability and transparency in our conduct of business, I propose the following structural reforms. Mr. Speaker, since enactment, the Public Procurement and Asset Disposal Act 2015 has been operating without the supporting regulations. However, I am pleased to report that the Public Procurement and Asset Disposal Regulations 2020 have been published and are awaiting parliamentary approval. These regulations seek to enhance uniformity of operations across the procuring entities and promote the local economy through affirmative interventions on preferences and reservations. On e-procurement, Mr. Speaker, the government has finalized the e-government procurement strategy. According to this strategy, the government will procure and roll out an end-to-end e-procurement system by end of December 2020. Under the e-procurement system, all procurement processes will be undertaken on an online platform where benefits will accrue to the government procuring entities in terms of cost reduction, speed, transparency, accountability, and visibility. Mr. Speaker, in order to ensure the growth and sustainability of enterprises owned by women, youth, and persons living with disability, the National Treasury has re-engineered the access to government procurement opportunities portal to enable real-time registration and transparent monitoring of the implementation of the scheme. The system has also been linked to other government institutions, including Kenya Revenue Authority, National Council for Persons with Disability, Registrar of Companies, and IFMIS to facilitate faster verification and reporting. In addition, Mr. Speaker, the National Treasury has directed all procuring entities to ensure prompt payment for all contracts performed by these target groups. Mr. Speaker, allow me to focus my attention on the construction industry, where I believe we can create the much-needed jobs for the youth by hiring local contractors. The government is aware that local contractors in general have had challenges of undertaking infrastructure projects due to limited technical, financial, and managerial capacities. This has resulted in participation of more foreign contractors in local contracts at the expense of local contractors. In this respect, the government will review the contracting framework for infrastructure projects in the country with a view of ensuring participation of local contractors in local contracts. These will retain domestic revenues within the country and create jobs for the youth contractors. Mr. Speaker, the restriction placed on businesses and services as a result of COVID-19 pandemic have had significant adverse effects on the performance of strategic state-owned enterprises offering essential services. Given the contingent liabilities that may arise thereof, I have constituted a technical team at the National Treasury and Planning to review the challenges facing state-owned enterprises and recommend remedial actions within 90 days. On pending bills, Mr. Speaker, we have noted that several state corporations and semi-autonomous agencies hold significant amounts of pending bills owed to contractors, suppliers, SACCO remittances, and other statutory deductions. This practice should not be allowed to continue. Mr. Speaker, following a cabinet directive, the National Treasury constituted a pending bills multi-agency team to deal with the existing historical and contested pending bills. Significant progress has been made to settle some of the pending bills. I direct all principal secretaries and accounting officers to clear all pending bills in the MDAs and SAGAs, respectively. Further, Mr. Speaker, going forward, the National Treasury may withhold exchequer releases to the MDAs or SAGAs with pending bills until an approved payment plan for all pending bills is agreed upon. Mr. Speaker, the continued growth and competitiveness of our financial services sector is critical in supporting economic development. I wish to state that our financial sector remains strong and stable despite the shocks occasioned by the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr. Speaker, the banking sector remains stable and resilient with strong liquidity and capital adequacy ratios. The Central Bank of Kenya has been closely monitoring the sector to identify vulnerabilities, especially those associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. The bank has been at the forefront and has rolled out various policy and regulatory measures to support the sector. Mr. Speaker, during the last 1 year, the government, through Central Bank of Kenya, rolled out a mobile-based service to facilitate retail investors participate in government securities, a convenience to investors during this pandemic. Mr. Speaker, in order to strengthen our position as regional financial hub, the National Treasury is in the process of operationalizing the Nairobi International Financial Center. The center will play an important role in attracting investments and private capital to support economic growth, as well as mobilizing additional financing for the Big Four projects and further providing new financing options for Kenyan businesses. Mr. Speaker, to enhance the safety and integrity of our financial system, the National Treasury, together with other stakeholders, will conduct Kenya's first national risk assessment on money laundering and terrorism financing. This will assist the country's competent authorities to assign responsibilities for combating money laundering and terrorism financing to the relevant government agencies on the basis of identified risks and vulnerabilities. Mr. Speaker, the high cost of housing units and limited access to affordable long-term finance remain a leading house market constraint. To address this challenge, the government established the Kenya Mortgage Refinance Company, whose main purpose is to provide long-term funds to primary housing mortgage providers in the housing sector. In this regard, the company will offer fixed-rate long-term loans at concessional rates to mortgage providers who are expected to pass the benefit to citizens at a lower than market rates. The company has raised capital of Kenyan 2 billion, while the National Treasury has mobilized additional Kenyan 35 billion from development partners to support the company's operations. Mr. Speaker, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, Kenya Mortgage Refinance Company will help to maintain adequate liquidity among primary housing mortgage providers in order to keep housing finance and the housing market functioning. This will avert potential credit crunch that will hurt lower-income households and interrupt efforts to support affordable housing. Mr. Speaker, the new company is also expected to play a significant role in the structuring of the proposed National Credit Guarantee Scheme in order to create an effective backstop mortgage guarantee component to cover the losses incurred by the lenders on future home loans. Mr. Speaker, in the year 2015, the investment guidelines under the retirement benefits regulations were amended to allow pension schemes to invest up to 10% of their assets in private equity funds and venture capital funds licensed by the Capital Markets Authority. However, the Capital Market Act was not amended to provide for regulations of this private equity and the venture capital. In this regard, I have proposed amendment to the Capital Market Act to provide for the regulation of private equity and venture capital companies by the authority. In addition, Mr. Speaker, I propose to amend the Capital Markets Act to remove the function of payment of beneficiaries from collected and claimed dividends, since these are functions currently domiciled and an unclaimed financial assets authority. Mr. Speaker, the increasing public pension budget and accumulation of pension claims remain a challenge. In this regard, the National Treasury is reengineering and upgrading the pension systems in order to clear all pension payments backlogged by the end of the calendar year. This will pave way for a modernized pension management system that will guarantee smooth transition of retirees from a monthly salary check to a monthly pension payment. To ease the pension burden on the exchequer, the National Treasury is committed to roll out the Public Service Superannuation Scheme in the financial year 2020-21. Further, Mr. Speaker, to support the pension sector in general, the government is developing a national retirement benefits policy that will harmonize all pension laws. This will strengthen the legal and regulatory framework to achieve a comprehensive pension coverage across the formal and informal sectors and better protect the interests of beneficiaries and rights of pension contributors. Mr. Speaker, In September 2019, this House approved the County Government Retirement Scheme, which provides for the establishment of an umbrella retirement scheme for county government. Thereafter, petitions were filed in court challenging the law, thus paralyzing its operation. To this effect, the National Treasury undertook to pursue all legal means to resolve this matter and ensure that county government employees have a scheme that safeguards members' pensions. Mr. Speaker, further, the government is working on establishing a national micro-pension scheme with a sustainable model that combines long-term saving with short-term needs that will be open to all marginalized informal workers who constitute over 80% of Kenya's labor force. Mr. Speaker, the Retirement Benefits Authority Act does not provide for sanctions in case of failure or delay in submission of the actuarial valuation reports within the specified period. In this regard, I propose to amend the Retirement Benefits Authority Act to impose a penalty to pension schemes who fail to submit actuarial valuation reports to the authority within the specified timeline. The actuarial valuation reports are important in determining the performance of the scheme. Mr. Speaker, framework for responding to disasters in Kenya are fragmented across laws. These has hampered the ability of governments to respond to disasters more effectively. To address this challenge, the government will develop a harmonized disaster risk management legal framework to guide the management of disasters in Kenya. To this end, we shall also finalize the Disaster Management Fund regulations to facilitate effective and efficient response to disasters in a more coordinated manner. Mr. Speaker, globally, climate change is a key concern, like other counties. The Kenyan economy is vulnerable to its effects. Over the last 10 years, we have experienced increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather. Mr. Speaker, in order to minimize the adverse effects of this phenomenon on the economy, we need to pursue a green economic development path. In this regard, the National Treasury proposed to tap into the green climate financing by issuing the first sovereign green bond to finance major infrastructure projects in the financial 2020-21. These proceeds will be directed towards green projects at both the national and county level. Mr. Speaker, execution of the budget for 2019-2020 has progressed well despite the challenges of reduced revenue performance. The COVID-19 pandemic has not only worsened revenue performance in 2019-2020, but will affect revenue in 2020-21 budget. In particular, import-related taxes such as import duty, VAT on imports, import declaration fees, and rural development levy have been negatively affected due to lower imports and reduction of trade among countries. Further, other domestic taxes have been severely affected by declining incomes and depressed consumptions. As noted earlier in my statement, in order to cushion Kenyans against the adverse impact of the pandemic and to further increase liquidity in the economy, the government lowered tax rates for corporate and personal incomes, turnover tax, value-added tax, and provided tax relief to low-income earners and employees. These measures are estimated to cost the Exchequer Kenya 172 billion in revenue foregone by government in one financial year. Mr. Speaker, in order to recoup part of this revenue loss, we submitted this House proposals to lower the level of tax exemptions. It is important to note that in the year 2018, the tax revenue foregone by government through tax incentives, or for that matter exemptions, amounted to Kenya shilling 535 billion, or 6% of GDP, which is considered one of the highest levels globally. Whereas these tax incentives are well intended, they have limited the capacity of government to fund critical expenditures. In addition, a critical review of the incentive shows that consumers have not benefited through commensurate reduction in cost of the goods and services. Further, some of these incentives have given undue advantage to some sector players over others, thus entrenching unfairness and stifling competition. Mr. Speaker, this therefore necessitated a review of the existing laws incentive regime with a view to minimizing distortions and providing a level playing ground for all taxpayers. In this respect, I have proposed further removal of some existing tax exemptions through the Finance Bill 2020. I urge honorable members of this House to support this endeavor that's expected to grow revenues for funding critical social and infrastructure programs. Mr. Speaker, the Kenya Revenue Authority has undertaken various reforms to enhance revenue mobilization. We shall continue to support and strengthen the capacity of the Kenya Revenue Authority to enable them collect revenues to fund government programs. Mr. Speaker, the fiscal framework for 2020-21 budget and the medium term has been revised to take into account the adverse impacts of the pandemic on revenue performance. In this respect, the 2020-21 budget targets revenue collection, including appropriation in aid, of Kenya shilling 1.89 trillion, which is equivalent to 16.8% of GDP. This is a stagnation from the estimated revenues of Kenya shilling 1.89 trillion, equivalent to 18.6% of GDP in the financial year 2019-2020. Of these, ordinary revenues in the financial year 2020-21 are projected at Kenya shilling 1.63 trillion, equivalent to 14.5% of GDP. Mr. Speaker, total expenditures in the financial year 2020-21 are projected at Kenya shilling 2.79 trillion, or 24.7% of GDP, from the estimated levels of Kenya shilling 2.77 trillion, or 27.2% of GDP in 2019-2020. The recurrent expenditures in the financial year 2020-21 will amount to Kenya shilling 1.82 trillion, or 16.2% of GDP. On the other hand, ministerial development expenditures that include foreign finance projects, allocation to contingency funds, and conditional capital transfers to the county government are projected at Kenya shilling 633.1 billion in 2020-21. This will enhance critical infrastructure in the budget. Mr. Speaker, taking into account the projected revenues and expenditure in the financial year 2020-21, the fiscal deficit, including grants, is projected to decline to Kenya shilling 840.6 billion, or 7.5% of GDP, from Kenya shilling 842.7 billion, or 8.3% of GDP in the financial 2019-2020. Going forward, Mr. Speaker, as we roll out the post-COVID-19 economic recovery strategy, we remain committed to gradually lowering the fiscal deficit to Kenya shilling 768.8 billion, or 6.1% of GDP in the financial year 2021-22, and further to Kenya shilling 570.4 billion, or 3.6% of GDP by 2023-24. In the financial year 2020-21, the fiscal deficit of Kenya shilling 840.6 billion will be financed through net external financing of Kenya shilling 347 billion, or 3.1% of GDP, net financing of Kenya shilling 493.4 billion, or 4.4% of GDP, and other net domestic repayment of Kenya shilling 627 million. Mr. Speaker, to achieve these targets, we will continue to contain growth in non-core recurrent spending and enhance our efforts in revenue mobilization. In this respect, we shall closely monitor the economic impact of COVID-19, and once the economy recovers, we'll review our fiscal plan, including tax measures, to strengthen public finances to sustainably fund our development agenda. Mr. Speaker, the government is concerned about perennial low absorption of donor funds that has denied Kenyans the full benefit of this financing. To remove impediments in the project's implementation and scale up absorption of donor funds, the government will put in place appropriate policies and administrative measures. These may involve reallocation of funds from slow-moving projects or non-startup projects to other priority projects and programs to minimize payments of unnecessary fees and charges. Mr. Speaker, let me turn to the state of our public debt. Our debt remains sustainable despite some of the debt burden indicators deteriorating due to impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has elevated expenditure pressures, reduced revenues, and export earnings. The debt burden is projected to decline over the medium term in line with the fiscal consolidation plan and implementation. Going forward, Mr. Speaker, the government is committed to implement the 2020 medium-term debt strategy, which recommends a shift towards concessional external borrowing and lengthening of maturity structure of the domestic debts. In addition, the debt and borrowing policy approved in early 2020 will guide management of public debt. Mr. Speaker, as an alternative source of finance to fund public projects, the government shall revitalize the public-private partnership framework. Indeed, public-private partnerships have the potential to accelerate economic growth and development by crowding in private sector participation in the financing of capital-intensive infrastructure projects. Mr. Speaker, the reforms in this area will include amending the PPP Act to remove unnecessary approvals and redundant processes, as well as restructure and strengthen institutions responsible for implementing such projects. The government will also streamline and standardize the appropriate credit enhancement tool, including the government letter of support, partial risk guarantees, and indemnity guarantees, as well as viability gap funding where necessary, to enhance bankability of projects. Mr. Speaker, the government, through these arrangements, targets to mobilize approximately $200 billion in the financial 2020-21 by concluding the financing of several projects that are currently at advanced stage of negotiation. These projects are drawn from, among others, the transport, energy, health, housing, and manufacturing sectors of the economy. Mr. Speaker, let me turn to the highlights of the government spending priorities in the coming financial year. The total program spending for the financial 2020-21, excluding redemptions, amounts to shilling 2.79 trillion. Mr. Speaker, the budget for financial 2020-21 will continue the implementation of the Big Four agenda. Thus, the targeted expenditures prioritize employment creation, youth empowerment, supporting manufacturing activities, enhancing health coverage, improving food security, and living conditions through affordable housing. To support these initiatives, I have set aside shilling 128.3 billion for the Big Four agenda drivers and enablers. Mr. Speaker, the government continues to prioritize healthcare by scaling up universal health coverage to all the counties. To improve health outcomes, I have proposed an allocation of shilling 111.7 billion to the health sector in this budget. Out of this, shilling 50.3 billion is for activities and programs for the attainment of universal health coverage by the drivers and enablers. Mr. Speaker, the budget for the health sector includes shilling 19.2 billion to address and lower cases of HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis in the country. Shilling 6.2 billion for the managed service equipment. Shilling 5.3 billion to transform the healthcare systems for universal health coverage. Shilling 4.1 billion to cater for free maternity health care, and shilling 1.8 billion to provide medical cover for the elderly and severely disabled in our society. Mr. Speaker, other allocations to improve health service delivery includes shilling 15 billion for Kenyatta National Hospital, shilling 10 billion for the Moi Teaching and Referral Hospital, shilling 7.2 billion for Kenya Medical Training Centers, shilling 2.5 billion for the Kenya Medical Research Institute, shilling 1.2 billion to Madari Hospital, and shilling 4.3 billion as a conditional grant to level 5 hospitals in the counties. Mr. Speaker, to ensure the success of affordable housing program, the government continues to forge partnerships with the private sector and development partners. In this budget, I have proposed an allocation of shilling 15.5 billion to the housing, urban development, and public works sector. Out of these, shilling 6.9 billion will cater for the affordable housing program undertaken by the driver and enablers. We are also concluding discussions to bring on board an additional shilling 3.6 billion from the African Development Bank, shilling 7.5 billion for the Kenya Urban Program, and Kenya shilling 1.1 billion for the ongoing construction of Gikomba, Githurai, Chaka, Kamkunji, and Agoreti markets. Mr. Speaker, the government continues to scale up reforms to promote investment in the manufacturing sector to support and protect local industries. To promote local industries, I have proposed an allocation of Kenya shilling 18.3 billion for this cluster. Of these, Kenya shilling 1.4 billion will go to the Kenya Industrial Entrepreneurship Project, Kenya shilling 3.5 billion for the development of Special Economic Zone, Textile Park in Naivasha, Kenanie Leather Industrial Park, and at the River Textile Hub. In addition, Mr. Speaker, I have set aside Kenya shilling 843 million to support modernization of Rivertex, Kenya shilling 800 million for the development of various micro, small, and medium enterprises in Kenya, Kenya shilling 715 million for the Kenya Youth Empowerment and Opportunities Project, Kenya shilling 500 million to support the dairy processing, and Kenya shilling 3 billion for the Ongokundu Special Economic Zone. Mr. Speaker, the government remains committed to reducing the number of food insecure Kenyans. Towards this end, the government will continue to expand irrigation schemes, support large-scale production of staples, increase access to agricultural inputs, implement programs to support smallholder farmers, and promote the use of appropriate farming techniques. Mr. Speaker, to support these initiatives, I have set aside shilling 52.8 billion for food and nutritional security. Out of this, Kenya shilling 10.6 billion has been proposed for the Kenya Climate Smart Agriculture Project, Kenya shilling 5.5 billion for the National Agricultural and Rural Inclusivity Project, Kenya shilling 4.1 billion for the Kenya Cereal Enhancement Program, Kenya shilling 730 million for the Food Security and Crop Diversification Project, and Kenya shilling 10 billion for irrigation land reclamation. Mr. Speaker, other proposed allocations include Kenya shilling 1.8 billion to enhance aquaculture business development project, Kenya shilling 1.4 billion to support small-scale irrigation and value addition, Kenya shilling 1.3 billion to enhance resilience of pastoral communities, Kenya shilling 1.1 billion to enhance drought resilience and sustainable livelihood, Kenya shilling 1.6 billion to support processing and registration of title deeds, and Kenya shilling 500 million to advance agricultural loans through Agricultural Finance Corporation. Mr. Speaker, allow me to turn to other proposed expenditures that are critical in this budget. Mr. Speaker, the government continues to scale up the construction of a robust network of high-quality roads, railways, sea, and airports to enable Kenyans to enjoy the benefits of expanded infrastructure assets and improve our competitiveness. Towards this end, I propose an allocation of Kenya shilling 172.4 billion. This is in addition to allocation that I have already set aside for the economic stimulus program and the Big Four agenda, which support construction of roads and bridges, as well as their rehabilitation and maintenance. Mr. Speaker, I have set aside Kenya shilling 18.1 billion for SGR Phase 2, Kenya shilling 6 billion for the LAPSET project, Kenya shilling 5 billion for the Mombasa Port Development Project, and Kenya shilling 328 million for the insurance of ferries for the Likoni Channel. Mr. Speaker, to support generation of adequate and affordable energy, I have set aside Kenya shilling 63.3 billion, excluding the allocation for the Big Four agenda. Out of these, Kenya shilling 50.8 billion will cater for transmission and distribution of power, Kenya shilling 9.3 billion for development of geothermal energy, Kenya shilling 6.8 billion for electrification of public institutions, and Kenya shilling 900 million for provision of transformers in constituencies, development of nuclear energy, and exploration and mining of coal. Mr. Speaker, ensuring a safe and secure environment is vital in our drive to attain economic transformation. Towards this end, government will strengthen the security agencies by equipping them in order to increase their effectiveness and rapid response to incidents of crime. Mr. Speaker, to support security operations in the country, I have proposed Kenya shilling 167.9 billion in this budget to our security agencies, defense and national intelligence services, leasing of police motor vehicles, national communication and surveillance systems, police modernization, and the equipping of the National Forensic Laboratory. Mr. Speaker, I have also set aside shilling 3.4 billion for medical insurance, shilling 2.2 billion for group personal insurance for the National Police and Prison Services, and shilling 1 billion for the National Integrated Identity Management Systems. Mr. Speaker, the government continues to make sustained investments in the education sector in order to enhance access to quality basic and higher education. In this budget, I have set aside shilling 497.7 billion to fund programs in this sector. This accounts for 26.7% of the budget. Specifically, Mr. Speaker, I have proposed shilling 59.4 billion to cater for free day secondary education program, and shilling 12.4 billion for free primary education program. Mr. Speaker, to increase the teacher-to-student ratio, I have proposed shilling 2 billion for the recruitment of 5,000 teachers. This is further to the provision for hiring at least 10,000 teachers in turns under the Economic Stimulus Program. To improve health conditions and support education, achievement of our school-going children, I have set aside shilling 1.8 billion for the school feeding program. Mr. Speaker, other proposed allocations to the education sector includes shilling 6.3 billion for the construction and equipping of technical institutions and vocational training centers, shilling 4 billion for examination fees waiver for all Class 8 and Form 4 candidates, shilling 800 million for the digital literacy program and competency-based curriculum, shilling 323 million for the National Research Fund, shilling 94.9 billion to support university education, and shilling 16.8 billion to the Higher Education Loans Board. Mr. Speaker, as a government that deeply cares for its most vulnerable members of society, I have proposed shilling 17.6 billion for cash transfers to the elderly persons, shilling 7.9 billion for orphans and vulnerable children, and shilling 1.1 billion for cash transfer to persons with severe disabilities. Mr. Speaker, I have also set aside shilling 4.3 billion for the Kenya Hunger Safety Net Program, shilling 2.5 billion for the Kenya Social and Economic Inclusion Project, shilling 3.5 billion for Kenya Development Response to the Displacement Impact Project, and shilling 400 million for the National Development Fund for persons with disabilities, and a further shilling 720 million for purchase of a building for these vulnerable members of our society. Mr. Speaker, to enhance equity and reduce poverty, I have proposed shilling 41.7 billion for the National Government Constituency Development Fund, shilling 2.1 billion for the National Government Affirmative Action Fund to promote regional equity and social development, and shilling 6.8 billion for the Equalization Fund to finance programs in marginalized areas. Mr. Speaker, to address the challenges that our youth continues to face, we have dedicated resources to youth empowerment programs and supporting businesses by youth, women, and persons living with disabilities. In this regard, I have set aside shilling 10.2 billion to the National Youth Service, shilling 2.1 billion for the Kenya Youth Empowerment Program, shilling 359 million to the Youth Enterprise Development Fund, shilling 82 million to the Youth Employment and Enterprise WEZO, and shilling 150 million to the Women Enterprise Fund. Mr. Speaker, our prosperity as a country is to a larger extent hinged on our ability to take full advantage of the rapid technological advances. For this reason, Mr. Speaker, the government continues to invest in this area to boost digital literacy and skills, as well as expand digital infrastructure to improve access to affordable broadband connectivity. In this budget, Mr. Speaker, I have proposed shilling 14.9 billion to fund initiatives in the information communication technology sector. Specifically, shilling 700 million for the government shared services, shilling 800 million for the digital literacy program, and shilling 1.2 billion for rehabilitation of national optic fiber backbone phase 2 expansion cable. Mr. Speaker, the government is fast-tracking the establishment of the Konza Technopolis City, which will position Kenya as a world-class ICT hub. For this reason, I have enhanced allocation to the project by setting aside Kenya shilling 6.3 billion for the horizontal infrastructure phase 1 for Konza, Kenya shilling 400 million for the ongoing construction of Konza Technopolis Complex phase 1B, and Kenya shilling 5.1 billion for Konza Data Center and its Smart City Facilities project. Mr. Speaker, sports, culture, tourism, and arts contribute immensely to our economic development by boosting job creation for our youth and generating foreign exchange. To support this sector, I propose an allocation of shilling 14 billion to the Sports, Arts, and Social Development Fund. I have also set aside shilling 2.5 billion for the Tourism Promotion Fund and shilling 3.8 billion for the Tourism Fund. Mr. Speaker, the government continues to invest in clean water supply and put in place measures to control floods and harvest rainwater, as well as protect the environment. In this budget, Mr. Speaker, I have set aside shilling 82.7 billion to support environment and water conservation. In particular, shilling 42.6 billion is geared towards the development of water and sewerage infrastructure. Shilling 10.9 billion for the management of water resources, and shilling 8.6 billion to support water storage and flood control. This includes shilling 500 million earmarked for the initial works for the construction of Kurusoin Dam along River Nyando, and shilling 1.3 billion for water harvesting and storage for irrigation. Mr. Speaker, I have also set aside shilling 10.9 billion to support conservation of forests and water towers. Shilling 10 billion for irrigation and land reclamation, shilling 10.8 billion for wildlife conservation and management, shilling 2.7 billion for environmental management and protection, and shilling 1.6 billion for meteorological services. This allocation excludes the provision under the Economic Stimulus Program and the Big Four agenda. Further, Mr. Speaker, the government will implement the Kenya Financing Locally Led Climate Action Program to deliver climate finance at the local level where its impacts are felt most. To start off the project, I have proposed to allocate shilling 100 million in the financial 2020-21. Mr. Speaker, to sustain the drive against corruption, instill good governance practices, and recover corruptly acquired assets, I have enhanced allocation to the institutions mandated to fight corruption. In particular, Mr. Speaker, I have set aside shilling 3.1 billion for the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission and a similar amount for the Office of the Director of Public Prosecution. Shilling 149 million for the Unclaimed Financial Assets Authority, shilling 158 million for Asset Recovery Agency, shilling 619.1 million for the Financing Reporting Center, shilling 7.9 billion for the Criminal Investigation Agencies, and shilling 5.2 billion for the Office of the Auditor General. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, to support the oversight and legislative role of Parliament and access to justice, I have proposed shilling 37.3 billion to Parliament and shilling 18.1 billion to the judiciary. Mr. Speaker, in the financial year 2020-21, county governments have been allocated shilling 369.9 billion, which comprises 1. Kenya shilling 316.5 billion as equitable share, Kenya shilling 13.7 billion as additional conditional allocation from the national government, Kenya shilling 30.2 billion being external loans and grants, and Kenya shilling 9.4 billion from the Roads Maintenance Levy Fund. Mr. Speaker, in February 2020, the national government and the Nairobi City County government entered into an agreement through which the county transferred some functions to the national government. To manage the transferred functions, the national government established the Nairobi Metropolitan Services. In order to facilitate performance of the transferred functions, the Nairobi Metropolitan Services has been allocated shilling 26.4 billion in the financial 2020-21, which includes shilling 15.95 billion from the Nairobi County's equitable revenue share for the financial 2020-21, and Kenyan shilling 660 million as additional conditional allocations related to the transferred functions. The balance of Kenyan shilling 9.78 billion will come from the county's local revenue. The NMS has also been allocated Kenyan shilling 1.5 billion from the national government's equitable revenue share to finance the Mukuru renewal project. Mr. Speaker, further to the Presidential Directive of February 2019, the National Treasury, jointly with other stakeholders, has finalized the development of an integrated development management system for county government. The system, which is aimed at eliminating leakages and high revenue collection costs of the county, is expected to be in place by the end of the financial year 2020-21. Mr. Speaker, I'm aware that the county government's Revenue Raising Process Bill 2018, which was sponsored by the National Treasury, has recently elapsed. In this context, I have resubmitted the draft bill to the Attorney General so that it may be reintroduced in Parliament. The principle underlying the proposed legislation is that counties may not impose, vary, or waive a tax, fee, or any other charge in a way that materially and unreasonably prejudices national economic policies, economic activities across county boundaries, and the national mobility of goods, services, capital, or labor. I appeal to honorable members to reconsider the merits of this proposed legislation, which was developed through widely consultative approach that incorporated all key actors, including institutions of Parliament. Mr. Speaker, in line with the Presidential Directive on the settlement of pending bills, Kenyan shilling 36.7 billion, representing 71.5% of the total eligible bills verified by the Auditor General, has been settled by the county government as at May 2020. I urge county government to clear outstanding bills by 30th of June 2020 and ensure no further build-up of expenditure arrears. Mr. Speaker, in the financial year 2020-21, beneficiary counties have been allocated Kenyan 6.8 billion under the Equalization Fund. I am aware that there are disbursement arrears, and I wish to give an assurance that future allocations will be enhanced to make up for the shortfalls. Mr. Speaker, in a High Court ruling of November 2019, the guidelines on administration of Equalization Fund were declared unconstitutional, null and void. Effectively, the Fund's Advisory Board was disbanded and all operations halted, including payments for ongoing projects. The ruling directed that the National Treasury to develop a new Equalization Fund statutory instrument. In compliance with the ruling, a new draft statutory instrument for the fund has been developed and is ready for gazettement and tabling before Parliament. I'm also aware, Mr. Speaker, the existence of a 2019 private members' bill on the Equalization Fund, which was passed by the National Assembly and is currently before the Senate. In this context, I wish to propose, honorable members, to initiate a process to harmonize efforts to achieve sustainable administration of this fund. Mr. Speaker, the Constitution requires the two-third levels of government to conduct their mutual relations based on consultation and considerations, and to respect the functional and institutional integrity of government at other levels. The objective is to achieve whole government approach to provide synergies and common size delivery solutions. Mr. Speaker, towards this end, the government will leverage on the intergovernmental framework for the implementation of national government programs and projects at counties formulated in 2019 to harmonize implementation of plans such as the Big Four development agenda, as well as policies between the two levels of government, including planning and budgeting. This is part of efforts to achieve an all-government approach to development. Mr. Speaker, the rest of my statement is on tax measures for the financial 2020-21 budget contained in the Finance Bill 2020, which I submitted to this House in April 2020, in line with the requirements of the Public Finance Management Act 2012. Further, I will highlight measures on cushion duty as agreed at the regional level during the East African Community Pre-Budget Consultation meeting for the financial year 2020-21. These measures are expected to generate about Kenyan shilling 38.9 billion in tax revenue to the Exchequer. Mr. Speaker, Manufacturing is a major pillar in the Big Four agenda, where the government aims to increase the contribution of the sector to GDP from about 8% to 15% by 2022. In this regard, I have proposed at the regional level measures aimed at promoting local manufacturing and also measures to ensure that locally manufactured products are competitive. Mr. Speaker, the customs measures that have been agreed upon at the regional level shall, in accordance with the East African Community practice, be effective from 1st July 2020. I wish to highlight a few of the measures that have direct impact on Kenyan manufacturers. Mr. Speaker, our metal and allied sector continues to face stiff competition from imported iron and steel products. In order to protect the sector, the rate of import duty of 35% with the corresponding specific rates on a wide range of these products have been maintained for another year. Kenya has sufficient capacity to produce paper and paperboard products. In order to protect manufacturers of these products from cheap imported products, we have maintained the import duty rate at 25% for another 1 year. Mr. Speaker, Kenya has capacity to manufacture baby diapers. However, the imports used in manufacturing these products attract import duty. In order to support manufacturing of the products locally, all inputs for manufacturing of baby diapers will be imported duty-free under the South African Community Duty Remission Scheme. In addition, to promote local production of new clothing and apparels, including fashion and design, imports used in the textile and apparel sector will be imported duty-free under the scheme. Mr. Speaker, the telecommunications sector provides good opportunities for innovations, particularly for our youth. In order to stir growth in this sector and encourage local investment, import for assembly or manufacture of mobile phones will be imported duty-free under the South African Community Duty Remission Scheme. Mr. Speaker, leather and footwear sector has capacity for manufacturing footwear considering we have adequate raw materials. It is important for this sector to be protected from cheap imported products in order to encourage investments in the sector. In this regard, we have maintained the specific rates of duty in addition to 25% duty rate, which were granted last year. This will also safeguard government revenues by curbing undervaluation of such imported products. Mr. Speaker, there is need to protect local producers of electrical parts and accessories. In this regard, we shall be applying the imported duty rate of 35% instead of 25% on such products for 1 year. Mr. Speaker, the East African Community region has agreed to grant duty remission on raw materials and imports for manufacture of masks, sanitizers, ventilators, and personal protective equipment, including coveralls and face shield. This will enhance measures aimed at containing COVID-19 in addition to encouraging local production of such products. Mr. Speaker, as a long-term measure, the East African Community region has agreed to amend the East African Community Customs Management Act to exempt from import duty supplies for diagnosis, prevention, treatment, and management of epidemics, pandemics, and health hazards to deal with any future occurrences of such nature. Mr. Speaker, the government introduced a simplified monthly rental income tax in 2016 to enhance tax compliance. Under this regime, the rental income is taxed at the rate of 10% for individuals earning annual rent income of Kenya shilling 10 million and below. Mr. Speaker, the Kenya shilling 10 million per annum threshold has brought positive impact on tax compliance. I therefore propose to raise this threshold to Kenya shilling 15 million per annum in order to bring more landlords to the simplified regime. Mr. Speaker, some companies continue to declare losses year in, year out, hence not contributing to the exchequer in terms of tax revenue. However, these companies enjoy facilities such as infrastructure, whose cost of construction and maintenance is serviced by the government through tax revenues contributed by other patriotic taxpayers. In order to ensure all taxpayers contribute to the construction and maintenance of our infrastructure, I have proposed to introduce a minimum tax that will be payable by all companies at the rate of 1% of their gross turnover. Mr. Speaker, with the first advancement in technology, many business transactions are increasingly being carried out through digital platforms. In some cases, due to the nature of the transaction, it is difficult to effectively tax the income derived through such platforms. It is therefore necessary to provide a framework that will facilitate taxation of such income. In this regard, I propose to introduce digital service tax on the value of transactions at the rate of 1.5%. Mr. Speaker, food security is one of the pillars of the Big Four agenda, and the government has put measures to support its implementation, including food production. To further this agenda, I propose to exempt maize or corn seeds from the value-added tax in order to make them affordable to our farmers. Further, I have proposed to exempt ambulance services from VAT in addition to medical, nursing, and dental services, which are currently exempt from VAT to cushion Kenyans from the high cost of such services. Mr. Speaker, to enhance tax compliance, I propose to introduce a voluntary disclosure program to allow Kenyans who in the last 5 years may have inadvertently made omissions in their tax returns to voluntarily disclose such omission and pay tax due. The program will run for 3 years. In order to encourage uptake of this program, I further propose to grant relief for penalties and interest in respect of the tax disclosed after payment of the principal tax. Mr. Speaker, currently, imports by Kenya Defence Forces and the National Police Services are charged import declaration fee and railway development levy. These charges reduce budgetary allocation of these institutions. I have therefore proposed to exempt from both the import declaration fee and railway development levy on all goods, including materials, supplies, equipment, machinery, and motor vehicles imported for official use by the Kenya Defence Forces and the National Police Service. Mr. Speaker, the government has been encouraging investments under the public-private partnership, particularly in the road sector. To further such partnerships, I propose to amend the Public Roads Toll Act to enable the persons who enter into an agreement with the government to collect road tolls on roads constructed and managed under such agreements. Mr. Speaker, the budget I have presented today involved making hard decisions in the quest to move our country forward. Faced with limited resources, the balancing has not been easy. We have channeled resources to cushion citizens and businesses from the adverse effects of COVID-19 pandemic, as well as interventions to support economic recovery. I firmly believe that the measures spelled out in this budget will create more jobs and transform the lives of Kenyans. Mr. Speaker, at the heart of these measures is our commitment to protect the lives and livelihood of citizens and support recovery of business. I believe that working together, we will withstand the current storm as we have done in the past. Mr. Speaker, at this juncture, allow me to express my gratitude to His Excellency the President for his leadership and wise counsel in the management of economic and financial policies of this country. I would also like to thank my fellow cabinet secretaries, principal secretaries, and their staff for contribution to the financial 2020-21 budget process. For their support during the preparation and approval of this budget, may I sincerely appreciate. My appreciation goes to honorable speakers of both National Assembly and the Senate and their respective clerks for overseeing the approval of submissions on the budget estimates, the financial 2020-21. Majority Leader, especially Honorable Duale of the National Assembly, as well as the Majority Leader of the Senate, Honorable Pugisio, for their relentless support to get most of the legislative proposals on finance matters passed through Parliament. members of the Budget and Appropriation Committee, led by the Chairman, and the Parliamentary Budget Office for the constructive and comprehensive engagements in their approval process for the budget estimates for financial year 2020-21. Members of the Departmental Committee on the Finance and National Planning, led by Honorable, the Chair, for their commitment and diligence in the approval of various tax laws process during the year. All members of the various departmental committees of the National Assembly and Senate for their cooperation and support. The management and staff of Kenya Revenue Authority, Central Bank of Kenya, all financial sector regulators, and the various agencies under the National Treasury and Planning for their contribution and advice during the budget process. The Commission on Revenue Allocation and its chairperson for their contributions. Management and staff of National Treasury, under the leadership of the Principal Secretary, Dr. Muya, the officers tirelessly work long hours, including most weekends and holidays, notwithstanding the constraining COVID-19 environment, to ensure that all budget and economic documents for the financial year 2020-21 are produced not only timely, but of high quality. These are the unsung heroes of this nation, and I appreciate the extra effort in this exercise. The management and staff of the State Department for Planning for the support, staff from the Attorney General's Office, our multilateral and bilateral development partners, as well as the private sector for their contribution to our development agenda through their technical and financial support, and the members of the Fourth Estate for actively keeping Kenyans informed of the developments in the country and their budget process for the financial year 2020-21. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I must express my sincere gratitude to Kenyans from all parts of the country for their insightful contributions, proposals, and suggestions as we finalize this budget. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic has been disruptive to our lives. I call upon Kenyans to pull together in the fight against the pandemic. Let us give safety and security of each other a priority. Follow the mandatory guidelines issued by the government on COVID-19 prevention as the country carefully and slowly begins to reopen for business and economic recovery. Mr. Speaker, I wish to thank our gallant health personnel who are on the front line of the COVID-19 war. Indeed, we can't thank them enough. May God bless them and their families for putting their lives as a shield for the rest of us against the virus. Mr. Speaker, we cannot forget the men and women in uniform and all the security personnel for maintaining law and order and safeguarding the security of the country. Mr. Speaker, my great appreciation goes to all Kenyans for demonstrating good citizenship by cooperating and supporting the government in this fight. Together, we have made good progress and still need to forge forward in our Kenyan spirit that we will win this war. Equally, Mr. Speaker, our heartfelt gratitude goes to the business community, donors and individuals who continue to donate resources to the Emergency Response Fund. The private sector has equally ensured that there are food supplies on our shelves, sanitizers are readily available, as well as masks that have greatly supported the common humanity. Mr. Speaker, I am well aware that the success of the measures I have outlined today will depend on the health behavioral change of our people. This strict discipline has been ably demonstrated by the health professionals in the fight against COVID-19 pandemic. Let us all pull together in observing the various protocols as advised by the Ministry of Health. I thank you all. May God bless you all and the Republic of Kenya. Mr. Speaker, in April 2020, I submitted the budget estimates together with accompanying documents. As I conclude, I further submit the following documents to this August House and request that you receive them. 1. Budget statement for 2020-21 financial year, budget policy statement for the year 2020-20, estimates of the revenue grants and loans for financial year 2020-21 budget, financial statements for financial year 2020-21 budget, 2020 medium-term debt management strategy, budget highlights, the Mwananchi Guide, financial year 2020-21 budget, and finally, the statistical annex of the budget statement for the financial year 2020-21. Thank you, Honorable Speaker.
Honour members, I wish to thank the Cabinet Secretary from the National Treasury and Planning for having ably made the public pronouncement of the budget policy highlights for the national government for the financial year 2020-2021 and the medium term and the revenue raising measures contained in its speech. Honour members, as you are aware, today's budget speech is not to be accompanied by the usual cocktail and courtesies. In this regard, honourable members and all guests are invited to depart, particularly from the precincts of Parliament, at their own pleasure. And the time now being 4:35 p.m. Honourable members, the House stands adjourned till Tuesday, June the 16th at 10 a.m.
And there we have it. We've had the Treasury Cabinet Secretary Ukur Yatani tabling his maiden budget before the National Assembly. Some quick headline figures which have been mentioned by the Treasury CS. Aggregate expenditure stands at 2.7 trillion shillings, and of course the revenue is projected at 1.8 trillion shillings, and therefore what that means is that the government is staring at a deficit or a shortfall of 840.6 billion shillings, which the Treasury Cabinet Secretary has indicated that will be sourced both domestically and externally, with external sourcing standing at about 347 billion shillings. Some of the priority areas which have been accorded allocation, I should say, by the National Treasury include the aspects of food security at a proposed allocation of 52 billion shillings, propping up the horticulture sector at 1.6 billion shillings. The government is again talking about 3 billion shillings designated for subsidies of agriculture inputs. You'll remember that not too far back, CS for Agriculture Peter Munya indicated that the government was doing away with the input subsidy scheme. So we wait to see how this will exactly play out. For the manufacturing sector, once again, the government reiterating the designation of 600 million shillings set aside for the purchase of locally assembled vehicles. And the Treasury has also spoken to the subject of pending bills where it has indicated about 38 billion shillings, and of course directing the counties to accelerate the rate at which this is settled. The Kenya Mortgage Refinance Corporation, which is targeted at ensuring there's access to affordable housing, has raised thus far 2 billion shillings. That's the KMRC by itself. Of course, the Treasury CS indicated that the Treasury has mobilized additional resources from external financiers. So we wait to see that breakdown and how it looks like. The Treasury has also indicated matters regarding 5 billion shillings set aside for repair of damaged access roads. And the key goal here is to ensure that there's employment creation for the youth alongside the Kazim Tani, whereby he does indicate that thus far it has employed 26,000 youth across the country, and the target by the end of the financial year, that is June 2021, is to employ as many as 200,000. Some further 10 billion shillings has been designated for for the settlement of pending VAT refunds. The key caveat here is that the Treasury CS was very categorical that this will have to be verified and ascertained. So therefore, there's still some verification process to be done as far as this is concerned. And 1.6 billion shillings has been set aside for horticulture sector. This is a sector which has taken a severe beating in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has meant that there has been no much movement into the international markets of the horticultural produce. So this is something which farmers will definitely be receiving as a matter of celebration. Then the government, in a bid to incentivize the arrival of tourists post-COVID, has waived all landing and parking fees at all airports at JKIA, Mombasa, as well as Wilson. So that is something which comes as a relief to those who are in the tourism sector. Then 3 billion shillings has been set aside as seed capital for the credit guarantee scheme. You remember that this is part of the 8-point economic agenda, which has been delved into extensively by the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury in terms of a post-COVID stimulus engagement with the micro, small and medium-sized businesses. So the whole idea here is to advance some credit to help de-risk these businesses such that they will now be better placed to access capital from more formal financial institutions such as commercial banks and microfinance institutions. 10 billion shillings, as I said before, has been set aside for settlement of any pending VAT refunds subject to verification. And the government operationalized the credit guarantee scheme for MSMEs. And of course, there has been an indication that the growth rate for the GDP for 2020 is now expected to settle at 2.5%. That's down from 5.4% in the previous year, just to give you a sense of the sort of impact that Kenya does anticipate to suffer from the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, which has been amplified by the floods and the desert locust invasion, which is a matter of significant consideration in light of budget allocation. And 1.2 billion shillings in light of the COVID-19 pandemic has been set aside for the recruitment of additional healthcare workers. This is a subject which has been running consistently in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and how the country is well prepared to address the challenges it is now facing. And a total of 56.6 billion shillings has been set aside for the 8-point economic agenda. You remember this delves into manufacturing, agriculture, tourism, and many other sectors in terms of jumpstarting the economy in a post-COVID environment, if any such thing as post-COVID will indeed exist. And of course, 3 billion shillings has been set aside for businesses restructuring in the tourism sector. This sector has suffered a significant hit in light of COVID-19, and many have been shutting their operations. So this 3 billion shillings is really what in the enterprise world would be called patient capital to enable these businesses just to come back to life and at least sustain operations, get their employees back on board and be able to continue to operate. And the government still speaking about other issues such as allocations to ministries, departments and agencies will going forward be withheld in the event that it is identified that a state agency has been having a backlog of pending bills for no clear reasons. So this is meant to trigger the settlement, the first settlement of pending bills in the coming financial year. And the Treasury, interestingly here, and for those in the capital markets will take note of this, is proposing that all private equity funds and all their affiliate operations be placed under the administration of the Capital Markets Authority. This is something which, of course, many of us did not anticipate, but we'll be keen to see how that unfolds. There have been some significant allocations going to free primary education as well as the day secondary education, especially in light of the present situation where COVID-19 has disrupted the learning program. And of course, the Treasury CS also did indicate that there will be significant withdrawals of what he terms as unwarranted tax exemptions. And here's the interesting figure which he tabled, that the Kenyan government loses an estimated 535 billion shillings every year due to unwarranted tax exemptions. So this is a matter which many who have been benefiting from the exemptions, whether it's in the agriculture space or any other sector, will be keen to see how it impacts them, especially with regard to the finance bill of 2020 rather, I should say. And the proposed new tax measures are expected to mobilize an additional 38 billion shillings in terms of additional revenue. So this is one of the things which, of course, will be looked at very, very keenly. And we can see on our screens that CS Ukur Yatani seems to be giving a press conference. Let's listen in to what is transpiring on that end.
Are we ready to go? Yeah. Let me take this single opportunity to thank you very much for the time you've accorded us. You've taken all your time to highlight the budgets. Since there was a lot of expectation out there, the expectation of the country was quite heavy. And for having walked with us through the journey, we want to thank you in a very special way. As we indicated earlier, this is a very special budget because it's coming at with the background of global recession as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. You are aware trade, investments, capital, tourism, all sectors have been gravely affected. But we are happy that we are looking forward to a situation that we are going to come out of this much stronger. Because our role is to make sure that we have liquidity in the market, engage our people to do something productive, cushion the poor, and at the same time, facilitate through the stimulus package. We are confident that this is going to turn around the economy. And given that we have put containment measures and appropriate protocol to ensure that over time the economy will slowly pick up, we are confident that we'll come out of this challenge and come out as a stronger country and a stronger economy. Details of how we spent, how we expect is up to you because we've already covered in our budget speech, which is already on our website. You can access it. Yes. Yeah, I want to believe that I'll also share some of this question with our team. Regarding recurrent expenditure, whether I'm worried, I am not worried at all. At this time, for us to continue cushioning the economy, investment at all levels, whether recurrent or development, is necessary to keep the country going. Because the products and supplies that are procured locally is what now keeps the engine going, by making sure that the productive processes, the industries are functional, and there is that multiplier effect in the economy. So I am not very worried. The more expenditure, the more investment that we push down there is good for the economy. Number two, it's also clear that we've realized over time some development projects by partners or donors have been very slow. The rate of absorption has been very slow, particularly because of administrative inadequacies and sometimes because of sheer planning. So we want to reprogram these and ensure that we get value for this project. Projects that are intended to be completed within certain time frame, we want to strictly adhere to the timeline. If they are not performing based on the implementation, we are going to engage development partners and do a reprogramming and allocate that money to some other areas. The third one, you asked about the pending bills. I'm sure you are aware, for the last few months, we've really been forceful on payment of pending bills. It's no longer business as usual. In the past, pending bills were treated as not very important matter. And therefore, the government lose, that discipline the respective officers lose discipline. What we've done so far, out of the pending bill of 43 billion that belong to the national government, to date, we are only remaining with a balance of about 14 billion. The rest, we have paid. Last year, by December, we had paid 14 billion. By this time, we had already paid 23 billion. And therefore now remaining with only some amount which is not very big. We've also put pressure on the counties. And by now, most of them are paid about close to 71%. We are remaining with the 2 months because we have not disbursed money for most of them, but the money for May. And we have agreed on a payment plan, which they have given us up to end of June. We think that's going to be there too. On the e-procurement, I'll ask the PS, Dr. Muya, to handle.
Yeah, the question about e-procurement and whether we are doing away with IFMIS. I think the point is that IFMIS has got a special facility for procurement, but in order for us to have robust data in terms of controlling the procurement that we do in the public sector, making sure that we monitor and compare and get value for money, we are looking for a robust e-procurement that can be integrated with IFMIS. And progress has been made, which is very significant to date, and we are looking at this as one of the ways in which we are going to improve the delivery of services by having a lower unit cost of procurement of government goods and services. But let me also touch on the issue about programming money out of some of the slow projects. One of the things that we are working on is a software system, which then will help us to make sure that we are able to manage our debts and the projects in a proactive way. And that way then we'll be able to look and see on an ongoing basis which projects are not performing according to plan, and therefore where we can then take away money from there and reprogram it to put it in projects that are progressing.
I think since we've had a really long day, so we want to ask for permission, but just to confirm to you, the e-procurement is complementary to IFMIS. It's going to use the same architecture in terms of the digital payment and the digital transaction. We want to thank you very much and look forward to meeting another time.
Now, with the data simulations that you have in place now, can you paint to us how the job market is likely to be impacted by coronavirus? How many jobs are likely to have been put on the line, and how many more are likely to be lost? Based on the corona model that the government has been using. And number two, when you look at the economic growth, I mean, now with everything good in place, what is the growth likely to be? And then number three, the issue of debt relief. Do we have a position yet as whether we need to approach lenders, for a temporary debt relief? And the issue of superannuation scheme, I mean, it has been pending for more than 10 years now. You have touched about it. You say it's likely to start in time now. Do we have a certain time frame as to when this is likely to start?
Those are just too many. Anyway. Yes. What? Alcohol.
There have been concerns from sectors such as alcohol manufacturing. The government appears so keen in increasing taxes without considering the effect that such an increase has in terms of tax collection in those sectors. What do you have to say about that?
You take the alcohol one.
I'll take alcohol.
And pension. Of course, we all know there's not business as usual. The sectors have slowed down. If you look at the sector of tourism, is actually the most affected. Service sector is generally affected. Transport is affected. But Kenyans are resilient and quite innovative. They are coming out now to try to see how best they can cope, how best they can maintain the flow of supplies, how best they can maintain their staff. And we are quite optimistic that with the appropriate protocols, the economy will slowly pick up because business will have actually come back to near normal in the next few months. So these are things that we are looking at. Regarding how many jobs have been lost, it's possible that we've lost substantial. I cannot give you the figure right away. We are carrying out a survey through the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. We'll be having this in the next round of brief that we are going to have. The growth in the growth rates, I captured in my statement that this year we were looking at 5.4, but we are unlikely to realize that. The growth is going to go down to 2.5. 2.5% of GDP to, if we are lucky, to 3%. But you know, how do you context this in the space of the global economy? Most economies of the world are actually registering negative growth. We are lucky in the region that our economy is quite diversified and fortified against these challenges. So we will not expect to go lower than 2.5 unless something worse than this happens. Regarding debt relief, we appreciate the initiative of the G20 and the multilateral financial institutions to press for a debt moratorium for about 6-7 months, up to December. We've carefully looked at it. We are happy with the proposal, but based on circumstance, we are still not sure, and we are looking at, we are trying to push for better terms, better concessions, because what's happening is that some of the conditions attendant to debt relief are quite punitive, because it will block us from further borrowing. It will also give us a challenge already with the bonds that we have, particularly the Euro bond and the rest. So based on this, we have not yet concluded our engagement with these institutions. Maybe PS?
Let's deal with the pension issue, and I'll actually expand it a bit because last year, you may remember that we had an RRI initiative to deal with the pensions that we have, and that was to sort out the backlog that we have. And so we are progressing with sorting out the pensions system, and right now we have got a team that is looking at the whole system from scratch and make sure that by end of this calendar year, we have got a system that delivers such that at the time of retirement, you are assured of when you retire, you will not wait so that you get your pension. So that is just on the general side of pensions. Now, in terms of the superannuation, we've already put in 10 billion shillings, and we are proposing this in the budget of 2020-2021. So that we can also tie this to the pensions reform that we are looking at in the pension sector, so that all of this go together. And so we are committed, we are clear, and we want to make sure that we've got a good pension system that works. Now, the other question that has been posed to us is about alcohol and the tax on alcohol. From an economics point of view, the demand for alcohol is inelastic, which means as you increase the price, the volume that people consume of alcohol does not change significantly. And so, informed by that economics, it's an area where we are clear in terms of raising revenue. We can raise revenue through alcohol consumption and taxing alcohol. It is not that we do it to be discriminative, but we do that knowing that it's an area where we can raise some revenues. And we'll continue to look to make sure that we encourage all the sectors anyway as we propose taxes to support our revenues.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
think we have given CS permission to go home.
No, I think
you have done
tomorrow.
You have done extremely well. Yeah, but sir, you did very well. I am very proud.
1
hour 30 minutes. Yes.
And that's our project.
Yes, sir.
The most important thing.
I was very keen on that side.
And that was Treasury Cabinet Secretary Ukur Yatani and his Principal Secretary, Mr. Muya, responding to questions from journalists following the tabling of the budget statement for the financial year 2020-2021, of course, highlighting a number of issues around whether Kenya will be seeking more concession on debt, as well as the issues of pending bills and whether they are targeting the sector of alcoholic beverages in terms of taxes. And PS Muya did rightly indicate that the demand there is inelastic and therefore they are very clear on how much revenue can be sourced from that end. And that has been NTV's budget coverage up to this point. We still have a lot more coming your way, including the Nation Leadership Forum, where I will be moderating a panel discussion focusing on a raft of the issues which have been spelled out this afternoon by the Treasury Cabinet Secretary. So don't dial away, just stay tuned. We will be right back with a lot more.
This is NTV. I help women find independence by training them in fish farming. It's tough on my back, joints, and can cause headaches. Panadol Extra relieves multiple types of pain.
If symptoms persist, seek medical advice.
The risk of illness-causing germs is increasing. It is believed that the coronavirus can remain on surfaces in your home for up to 9 days. Touching infected